The moment Eleanor Whitfield held out her hand to Nathaniel Carter, every conversation in that room died. People stared. Mothers pulled their daughters back. Charles Whitmore's face went cold, because everyone in Harlan County knew what kind of man Nathaniel was: the broken one, the silent one, the man nobody chose. And Eleanor knew exactly what they were all thinking. She held out her hand anyway. This is the story of a woman who saw what a whole county refused to see, and a man who had nearly stopped believing he was worth seeing at all. If this story moves something in you, subscribe and drop your city below. Let me see how far this has traveled. Eleanor Whitfield did not hesitate. She walked straight across that crowded room, past the silk gowns, past the whispers, past every person who had already decided what kind of man Nathaniel Carter was, and she held out her hand to him. The room went silent. She didn't care. This is a story about a woman who saw what everyone else refused to see, and a man who had nearly forgotten he was worth seeing at all. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop your city below. Let me see how far this has traveled. In the summer of 1817 came to Harlan County, Kentucky, the way it always did, slow and thick, the kind of heat that pressed down on your shoulders and didn't let go. Corn stood high in the fields along the Carter Road. The cicadas screamed from the trees, and every family within 20 miles of the Carter estate had one thing in common. By the time July arrived, they all had an opinion about Nathaniel Carter, and not a single one of those opinions was kind. It had been that way for 3 years, since the war. As he came back, people in Harlan County did not forget. And they did not forgive a man who refused to pretend he was fine. Nathaniel Carter was 35 years old. He owned more land than anyone in the county. His fields produced more tobacco than his father's had in a good decade. His horses were the finest in eastern Kentucky. By every measure that mattered to the families of Harlan County, he was a man who had everything. And yet every gathering, every Sunday after church, every market morning, people found reasons to look away from him, to step back when he approached, to let their conversations die into uncomfortable silence and then resurrect themselves the moment he moved on. His brother George was the one people loved. George Carter was 41, and shouldered, broad, easy with a joke, quick with a handshake. George ran the county's largest mill and had served 3 terms on the town council. George's wife, Helena, threw the finest parties in the county. George's children were well-mannered and praised by every schoolteacher who crossed their path. George Carter was what Harlan County understood, a man who fit where he was supposed to fit. Nathaniel did not fit. He was quieter than the county liked. He didn't come to the gatherings unless his brother pressed him hard enough. He didn't dance, didn't play cards at the tavern, didn't stand around in the churchyard after Sunday service, making the small talk that everyone understood was the real currency of community life. When he did appear somewhere, he stood at the edges of rooms. He watched people more than he spoke to them. His eyes moved differently than other men's eyes, too steady, too careful, as though he was always measuring the distance between himself and the nearest exit. The county had a dozen names for what was wrong with him. Shell-shocked, cold, touched in the head since the war. Not right. The way people said not right when they meant they didn't understand something and had no patience to try. 3 years ago, Nathaniel Carter came home from the war with a scar along his jaw, both his hands trembling in the cold, and a silent sense inside him so deep that even his own brother didn't know how to reach across it. He had been a cavalry officer. He had been decorated. He had watched things that could not be undone, and somewhere on those fields, the version of Nathaniel Carter who laughed easily and trusted openly had been left behind. He came home and he did not talk about it. He came home and he built things. The east wing of the Carter estate had become something between a workshop and a laboratory. X covered every surface, some working, some taken apart, gears and springs laid out in careful rows. A water pump he'd designed himself ran from a cistern on the roof to the kitchen. He'd built a mechanical loom that 3 families in the county had quietly borrowed the design for, though none of them would admit where the idea came from. He made toys for children who visited with their parents, small wooden horses with jointed legs, little birds with wings that moved when you wound a key in the back, and he left them on the edges of tables without ever making a thing of it. Because the making was what mattered to him, not the receiving of credit. The county looked at his workshop and saw evidence of eccentricity. A grown man hiding from the world behind gears and wood shavings. Eleanor Whitfield looked at his workshop and saw something else entirely. That came later. Eleanor was 27. She had been a widow for 2 years, and Harlan County had opinions about that too. And her husband, James Whitfield, had been a good man, steady, honest, hard-working, and his death from fever in the spring of 1815 had left Eleanor with a small house on the western edge of town, a garden that barely fed her through winter, and a reputation that sat in an uncomfortable space. Too young to be invisible, too poor to be sought after. Too independent in her manner for the mothers of the county to feel entirely comfortable presenting her to their sons. She was not beautiful in the way the county rewarded beauty. She was lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that didn't do much for you at first glance, but that you found yourself thinking about later. Sharp brown eyes that didn't look away when they should have. A mouth that pressed thin when she was deciding something, hands that were rough from real work. She spoke directly. She didn't tilt her head and soften her voice when men were in the room. She'd been known to correct a man's arithmetic at the market and not apologize for it. County women called her plain. The county men called her proud. Neither of these things was meant as a compliment, but Eleanor had long since stopped waiting for Harlan County's compliments. She taught reading to 3 children from families who couldn't afford the schoolhouse fees. She sold jam and dried herbs at the summer market. She took in mending when the money ran short, which it did more often than she liked. She was not happy, exactly, but she had made a kind of peace with her life, a working peace, a kind you build stitch by stitch when the prettier alternatives have already been closed off. She had never spoken to Nathaniel Carter before the night of the Whitmore summer gathering. She had seen him. You couldn't live in Harlan County for long without seeing him. But he moved through public spaces so quickly and so quietly that seeing him felt less like encountering a person and more like catching a glimpse of whether something notable that was already passing before you could fix it in your mind. The Whitmore summer gathering was held on the second Saturday of July in the wide yard behind Charles Whitmore's estate on the North Ridge. Charles Whitmore was 45. Prosperous, in the way that prosperous men in 1817 Kentucky were prosperous, land, 18 connections, a firm handshake, and a voice that filled a room without effort. He held this gathering every summer. It was the event of the season in Harlan County, the kind of event where attendance was noted and absence was noted even more. Eleanor went, because Margaret Hollis, who was the closest thing she had to a friend in the county, had pressed her to come. "You stay in that house too much," Margaret had said, 3 times in 1 week. "You'll grow into the walls if you're not careful." Eleanor had finally agreed, partly because Margaret was right and partly because she was tired of her own company. She wore her best dress, a pale blue cotton, clean and pressed, nothing remarkable. She arrived with Margaret in Margaret's husband's wagon, and they walked into the gathering together, and within 10 minutes, Margaret had found her own circle of women to stand with, and Eleanor was standing at the edge of the yard with a glass of lemonade, watching. She was good at watching. It was one of the things about her that made people uneasy, that careful, quiet attention she paid to everything. Most people at a gathering like this were performing. Eleanor was observing. There was a difference, and people felt it without being able to name it. She saw Charles Whitmore moving through his guests with the practiced ease of a man who had learned long ago that generosity, when visible enough, functioned as power. She saw George Carter near the food table, laughing with a group of men, his voice carrying easily across the yard. She saw Eleanor Carter by the rose bushes, instructing a servant about something with sharp, clipped gestures. Then she saw Nathaniel Carter come through the gate. He came alone. He moved the way she had noticed before quickly, deliberately, without looking at people directly. He wore a good coat, dark wool despite the summer heat, and his hat was pressed low. He made it about 15 feet into the yard before the first cluster of people noticed him, and the conversation faltered. Then, Charles Whitmore's voice cut through the noise. "Carter." Whitmore said it like a man identifying something he hadn't expected to find on his property. "He didn't think you'd make it out of that workshop of yours." There was laughter. Quick, scattered. The kind of laughter people produce, not because something is funny, but because it gives them something to do. Nathaniel stopped walking. He turned toward Whitmore. "George asked me to come," he said. His voice was low and even. "I came." "George asks you to come every year," Whitmore said pleasantly. "Yeah, and every year you sit in the corner and look at everyone, like they're pieces of machinery you're trying to figure out." More laughter. "People, Carter. Not clockwork. I'm aware of that," Nathaniel said. He wasn't angry. That was the thing Eleanor noticed immediately. He wasn't angry, and he wasn't embarrassed. He was simply absorbing it, the way a stone wall absorbs rain, taking the weight of it without shifting. His hands which hung at his sides, were very still. Too still, the stillness of a man who had learned to hold himself completely motionless when the alternative was letting something show. Eleanor set down her lemonade glass. Two men near the food table snickered about something. She couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone, and she could see from where she stood that Nathaniel could too, because something in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A small boy, maybe 6 years old, was standing near the hitching post at the edge of the yard. He'd been holding a carved wooden horse, one of those jointed ones that Eleanor had seen before and wondered about, and somewhere in the shuffle of the gathering he'd dropped it. The horse had broken. One of the jointed legs had snapped off at the pin. The boy was crouching over it, working at it with small, frustrated fingers, his lip pushed out in that particular way of a child trying very hard not to cry. Nathaniel saw him. Eleanor watched Nathaniel Carter change direction entirely, moving toward the boy without a word to anyone, crouching down beside him. He said something she couldn't hear. The boy looked up, startled. Nathaniel held out his hand, and after a moment, the boy placed the broken horse in it. Nathaniel produced a small tool from his coat pocket, a thin metal pin punch, the kind a watchmaker would use, and in less than 2 minutes, with the boy watching with wide eyes and the entire gathering paying no attention whatsoever, he repaired the toy. He handed it back. The boy's face went from the edge of tears to something so close to wonder that Eleanor felt her chest tighten. Nathaniel stood. He tipped his hat to the boy. He turned back toward the gathering. And Charles Whitmore was still talking. "Word is, he's got half the county's tools stored in that workshop and hasn't returned a one of them. Borrows without asking, George says. Helena had her favorite garden shears disappear for 3 months before they turned up in his workshop. Man's got no sense of property, no sense of not true," Eleanor said. She said it clearly. She wasn't shouting, she didn't need to shout, but she said it at a volume that carried, and it carried into a moment that had gone briefly quiet. And the words landed in the middle of Charles Whitmore's sentence, like a stone dropped into still water. Every head in the immediate vicinity turned toward her. Eleanor felt the full weight of that attention and did not flinch from it. Whitmore looked at her, he said, after a moment. "Mrs.," she said, "and those shears were returned in April. I know because I was there when he brought them back. He'd repaired the blades as well. Helena Carter knows it too." She looked at the women near the rose bushes. Helena Carter was looking at her with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read. Someone's memory appears to be suffering in this heat." Silence. Then, somewhere behind her, a single short sound of suppressed amusement quickly extinguished. Whitmore's face had stiffened. He was a man unaccustomed to being corrected by anyone, let alone a widow of modest means who had no social standing worth mentioning. He arranged his expression into something cordial and dismissive. "Well," he said, "we all have our champions, I suppose. and he turned back to the people around him as though she had simply ceased to exist. Eleanor turned. Nathaniel Carter was looking at her. He was maybe 12 feet away, close enough that she could see the scar along his jaw, a careful steadiness of his eyes brown, nay, she noticed, a very dark brown, like river water in shade, and the fact that he was completely still in the way she had noticed before. As though motion might cost something he couldn't afford to spend. He said nothing. She said nothing. After a moment, she walked toward him. Not because she had planned to. Not because she had thought it through. Because it seemed like the obvious thing to do, and Eleanor Whitfield had long ago made peace with the fact that what seemed obvious to her was often invisible to everyone else. She stopped when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. "I'm Eleanor Whitfield," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I know who you are." "Good," she said. "Then we're past introductions." She nodded toward the gathering. "Would you like to go stand somewhere less unpleasant? I saw some chairs near the fence." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might simply walk away, which she had already decided she would not take personally. Then he said yes. They walked to the chairs near the fence. They sat, and the gathering went on around them as though they were not particularly remarkable, which suited both of them perfectly well. "You didn't have to do that," he said, after a while. "No, Whitmore won't forget it. I expect not." She looked at the gathering. "He's the sort of man who catalogs grievances, but that's his concern, not mine." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. What he said about the shears. "You weren't actually there." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "I wasn't, so you lied. I stated something I considered likely to be true, and let the weight of the accusation fall on Whitmore to disprove," she said. "Which is not precisely the same thing." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something that had memory of a smile in it. "It's a fine line. Most useful lines are fine," she said. He looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees. The tool was gone back in his pocket. His hands were still now in a different way from before, less like a wall holding back weather, and more simply like hands at rest. She noticed the calluses. She noticed a recent burn along 2 fingers, the kind you got from metalwork. "Boy's horse," she said. "Did you make it?" "I make them sometimes." A pause. "For children who come through the estate with their parents." "Leave them out." Another pause. I don't present them. I just leave them where they'll be found." Why he considered this. "As I like the making," he said finally. "The thing itself doesn't matter much after that." She looked at him. "That's not how most people are." "No," he said, "I know that." They sat in a comfortable silence that Eleanor found surprising. Silence with most people in Harlan County was never comfortable. It was always weighted with what was not being said, the performance of ease that was actually effort. Silence was different. It had space in it. "Your workshop," she said. "I've heard about it. Everyone in the county has heard about it." Flat. Not bitter. Simply accurate. "What I've heard sounds interesting," she said. Glanced at her. "What you've heard is that I'm hiding in it." "That's how it's described," she allowed. "I'm more curious about the hiding place than the hiding." Almost smile came back. This time it reached a little further. "It's not a hiding place," he said. "It's just where I work." "What are you working on now?" "A water wheel." "Net. Smaller scale then." "And a mill wheel, something that a family with a creek could use to grind their own grain." "The current designs require too much flow. I'm trying to reduce the flow requirement." He said this quickly, the way people speak when they've been talking to themselves for so long that they've forgotten how to calibrate for an audience. Eleanor said, "That would help a lot of families out on the ridge." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, as though this was the first time someone had responded to that information with simple acknowledgement, rather than confusion or dismissal. "That's the point." They talked for an hour and a half. She did not know later how to account for it, because she was not someone who talked easily to strangers, and he was manifestly not someone who talked easily to anyone. And yet the conversation moved between them, without the awkward fits and stops she would have expected. He knew things a wide, eclectic, self-assembled knowledge that had grown in the particular way of someone who reads everything and observes everything and has no social life to interrupt the accumulation. He asked her questions and listened to the answers, which was rarer than it should have been. She answered honestly and without the performance of modesty that the county expected from women, which seemed to sit perfectly comfortably with him. He told her the water wheel was one of 7 projects currently in various stages of completion in the workshop. He told her about a mechanical contraption for lifting hay bales that his neighbor Robert Haynes had been using for 2 seasons. He told her about a method for preserving seed corn through winter that he'd developed based on something he'd read in a pamphlet from a Philadelphia Agricultural Society. He told her none of these things as a boast. He told them the way a person reports observations, simply because they are true and because she had asked. She told him about the children she taught. She told him about the difficulties of collecting payment from families who had agreed to pay, but whose circumstances changed seasonally. She told him she had been trying to develop a system of instruction that didn't require the children to have paper, because paper was expensive, and most of them couldn't consistently have it. He asked her 3 pointed questions about this and then said, without any build-up, sand trays. Shallow trays with fine river sand. Children can write with a stick, smooth it out, write again. Infinite repetition, no paper. She stared at him. Read something about it, he said. A method from, I don't remember where. A school somewhere, it might not. It's exactly right, she said. He stopped. I don't know why I didn't think of it, she said. It's exactly right. He looked at her. She looked at him. The gathering moved and chattered around them, and neither of them paid it any attention at all. When the light started going golden and the gathering began to wind toward its end, Margaret Hollis appeared at Eleanor's elbow with the expression of a woman who has been watching something unexpected and is now prepared to have many opinions about it. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, in a tone that managed to compress several questions into a single form of address. Eleanor stood, Margaret. Nathaniel stood as well, quickly, and reached for his hat. Mr. Carter, Margaret said, with the careful politeness of a woman cataloging information. Ma'am, he said. He tipped his hat. He looked at Eleanor. Anyway, something moved across his face, not quite uncertainty, but something in that family of feelings. Mrs. Whitfield, he said. Mr. Carter. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the gate. Eleanor watched him go. Well, said Margaret. Don't, said Eleanor. I wasn't going to say anything. Absolutely going to say something. Margaret was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. He's very strange, Eleanor. He is very particular, Eleanor said. That's not the same thing. She thought about the water wheel for 3 days after the gathering. She thought about sand trays. She went to the creek on the east side of her property and filled a shallow wooden box with the fine silt from the bank, and she brought it to the children on Tuesday morning, and she set a small stick beside it. A child, a girl named Patience, who was 6 and had never been able to hold a pen properly, picked up the stick and drew the letter P in the sand and looked up at Eleanor with an expression of pure astonished delight. Eleanor sat with that expression for a while after the children had gone home. Then she wrote a note. She addressed it to Nathaniel Carter at Carter Estate, Heir, Harlan County, and she gave it to the postal rider on Thursday morning, and it said, The sand tray works. Patience wrote her entire name this morning. Thank you for the D.A.E. Whitfield. She expected nothing back. She had learned at 27 not to expect things back. On Saturday morning, there was a note on her doorstep. She almost missed it. It had been slipped under the door sometime before she woke, and she nearly stepped on it when she came downstairs. It was written in a very precise, very cramped hand, the kind of hand that belonged to someone who did most of their writing in technical specifications. Mrs. Whitfield, I am glad it worked. If you require more sand, the south bank of Haynes Creek has a particularly fine grade. And Carter. And below that, as an afterthought that had clearly been added, and then nearly crossed out and then left. "Your students are fortunate." She read it twice, then she folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer, where she kept things did to want to know. Harlan County noticed. It always noticed. It was the primary function of small communities in 1817 Kentucky. Eleanor had come to believe the careful, relentless noticing of everything that deviated from pattern and the subsequent processing of that deviation into opinion. They had been seen talking at the Whitmore gathering for an hour and a half. This was noted. Eleanor Whitfield had publicly contradicted Charles Whitmore. This was noted, and Whitmore had not forgotten it, as she had predicted. Nathaniel Carter had sat in conversation at a social gathering for longer than he had ever done in 3 years of county residence. It was noted most carefully of all, because it was most inexplicable. The theories came as they always came in Harlan County, through the back channels of market mornings and church steps and women stopping each other on the road. "She's after his money." That was the most popular theory, and Eleanor expected it and was not surprised by it. A widow of modest means, a wealthy man who had no wife. The math was obvious to people who believed that the only reason a woman of her circumstances might seek out a man of his was financial. "She's trying to reform him." This theory had a slightly kinder undertone. Some of the more charitable women in the county believed Eleanor had appointed herself some kind of project of social rescue, that she was going to civilize the eccentric Carter man through the application of feminine patience and virtue. She doesn't know what she's getting into. This came from the men largely, and was delivered with a head-shaking quality that implied that Eleanor Whitfield, for all her supposed intelligence, lacked the sense to recognize danger when she sat next to it for 90 minutes. Eleanor heard all of these theories, because Margaret Hollis, to her credit, reported them faithfully. "What do you say to them?" Eleanor asked. "I say that Mrs. Whitfield is a woman who makes her own decisions and doesn't require the county's assistance with them." "Good," Eleanor said. "And then they tell me what happened to the Henderson girl who got involved with..." "I don't need to hear about the Henderson girl," Eleanor said. "Not involved with anyone. I sat next to a man at a gathering and had a conversation. He also told a lie on his behalf. I stated a likely truth aggressively," Eleanor said. "Difference." Margaret looked at her. "You said that to him too, didn't you?" "That compelling, Eleanor," Margaret said. And then she stopped, because she was a good enough friend to know when Eleanor had already made up her mind about something, and that in those cases the wisest course was to make sure Eleanor knew where to find help if she needed it. "You'll tell me if it goes wrong." "If something goes wrong," Eleanor said, "you'll know before I have to tell you." The second note arrived 11 days after the first. It was longer. It described in precise detail a modification to the sand tray design that Nathaniel had been considering, a slight lip along one edge that would prevent the sand from shifting when the tray was carried, but that which would allow the children to take the trays home rather than leaving them at the teaching space. A bottom. "I could build these, if you thought they would be useful. I have scrap pine from a fencing project. It would not cost you anything." Eleanor sat at her kitchen table for a long time with this note. Then she wrote back. Yes, she wrote. Yeah. And she asked a question about the water wheel, because she had been thinking about the families on the ridge and the mill distance, and a specific creek she knew, and she wanted to know whether the design would work for that particular waterway. Wrote back that day. Longer this time. Technical. Precise. Understandable, he wrote, as though he expected her to follow the reasoning, which she appreciated enormously. Wrote back and pointed out a variable he hadn't accounted for. The creek she described was spring-fed and maintained a more consistent flow than most county creeks. This changed the calculations. His response to this arrived faster than the others. The handwriting was slightly less cramped, slightly less controlled, the way writing gets when the writer is thinking faster than usual. All right, I hadn't considered a spring-fed source. Changes. Could you describe terrain around the source? The gradient above and below? I'd like to recalculate. She walked the creek that afternoon. She measured the gradient by the old surveyor's method her father had taught her, notched stick and a plumb bob, and she wrote everything down and sent it to him. 3 days later he appeared at her door. She opened it to find Nathaniel Carter standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and a rolled set of drawings under his arm. And the look on his face was that of a man who had been perfectly certain of a decision right up until the moment he was executing it. "I thought it would be easier to explain in person," he said. Jet. "Yes," she said. He came in. He spread the drawings on her kitchen table. He explained the revised calculations. She asked questions. He answered them without condescension, which was notable enough that she noticed it specifically. Made 2 suggestions. He incorporated both of them without argument, adjusting the drawings on the spot with a small graphite pencil he produced from his coat pocket. They worked for 2 hours. When they were done, she made coffee, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the late afternoon heat. And the silence between them was the same kind of silence it had been at the gathering, comfortable, present, not requiring anything. "Families on the ridge," he said finally. "Do you know them?" "None of them. The Harrisons, the Piketts, old Mr. Dunn on the far end." "Why?" "I'd need someone to introduce me," he said. "I brought a working model and wanted to explain it." He looked at the drawings. "People don't—" He stopped. Tried again. "People receive things better when someone they trust brings them." Eleanor understood what he was saying and what he was not saying. "I can do that," she said. He looked up. Something in his expression shifted briefly, so briefly she might have missed it if she hadn't been paying the kind of attention she paid to things. "You'd have to come out to the estate," he said, "to see the model when it's finished. Understand how to demonstrate it." "All right," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You know what people say." "Know exactly what people will say," she said. "I've already been hearing it." It was very quiet. "And it doesn't to Carter," she said. "Been the subject of Harlan County's opinions for 2 years. If I had ordered my life around them, I would have stopped teaching those children, stopped selling at market, and stopped leaving my house. Instead, I do all 3. She held his gaze. "Other people's theories about my motivations are their business, not mine." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Nathaniel." Raised an eyebrow. "My name," he said. "If we're going to be doing this, whatever this is, you should probably use my name." Something warm moved through her chest. She kept her face easy. "Eleanor," she said. He nodded. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table edge. He rolled the drawings, with the careful, practiced motion of someone who handles documents regularly. He stood. At her door he stopped. He turned back. "Patience," he said. "The girl who wrote her name." Eleanor looked at him. "How many letters?" he said. "Atience. She wrote all 7. He nodded. Something settled in his face that had not been there when he arrived. Put his hat on. He walked out into the July heat. Eleanor stood at the open door and watched him go down the road, and she thought, this is the beginning of something. She did not know yet what it would cost her, but she had been paying for things her whole life, and she had learned that the things worth having were never the cheap. She closed the door. In the kitchen on the table, she had left his coffee cup. She did not move it until the next morning. The sand trays arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 of them, stacked neatly on Eleanor's porch, before she was awake enough to have heard anyone come up the road. Each one was built from clean pine, sanded smooth on every edge, so no child would catch a splinter, with a slight lip along one side exactly as the note had described. The workmanship was precise and quiet, the kind of work that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Eleanor stood on her porch in the early heat and looked at them for a long moment. Then she carried them inside one by one. She did not send a thank you note this time. Nay, she waited until Thursday when Nathaniel had said he expected the first working model of the water wheel mechanism to be ready for a review, and she walked the 2 miles to Carter Estate in the morning, before the heat got serious. The estate itself was exactly what the county's gossip had suggested, and nothing like what the county's gossip had suggested. The house was large, older than most in the county, the kind of structure that had been built by someone with money and intention, but it had the feel of a place that was inhabited by one person instead of the family it was built for. The grounds were well kept in a functional sense, the fields tended, the fences sound, the approach road clear, but there were no flowers, no decorative elements, none of the touches that a wife or a mother would have added over time. It was a working property, maintained by a man who understood necessity and had not thought much beyond it. The workshop was in the east wing, connected to the main house by a covered passage. Eleanor knocked at the main door and got no answer, waited a moment, then followed the sound. She could hear a rhythmic, metallic tapping around to the passage and to the workshop entrance. She knocked there. The tapping stopped. "It's Eleanor," she called. A pause, then "Come in." She went in. The workshop was not what she had expected, which was chaos. It was the opposite of chaos. Every tool hung on the wall in its designated place. Every project in progress occupied its own labeled section of the long central work table. The clocks, and there were many of them, in various states of assembly, were arranged in a way that made immediate visual sense, progress moving left to right across their shelf. There was a smell of fresh wood and machine oil and something faintly metallic, and light came through 3 high windows that Nathaniel had clearly positioned for maximum utility across the work surfaces. Nathaniel was standing at the central table with a small gear mechanism in one hand and a questioning look on his face that dissolved when she walked in, replaced by something that was not quite welcome, but was in the same family. "The sand trays," she said immediately. "They're perfect." Patience tried to take hers home yesterday, and I told her she'd have to wait until I worked out a carrying method. "I can add a leather handle," he said. "Simple loop through a slot on the side." "I should have thought of it." "You thought of the lip," she said. That was the harder problem. She looked at the work table. "Is that it?" He set down the gear. "That's part of it." He moved to the far end of the table where a larger assembly shaft sat, gears and shaft and a paddle mechanism she recognized from his drawings. "Is the drive section. The wheel itself is outside. I had to build it to scale to test the flow dynamics." She followed him outside to where a large wooden wheel was propped against the workshop wall, 5 feet in diameter, the paddles angled at the precise degree he had calculated in the revised drawings. A barrel of water sat beside it on a raised platform, a pipe leading from barrel to wheel. And he climbed up and opened the pipe valve, and the water hit the paddles and the wheel turned, and Eleanor watched the shaft at the center rotate at a steady, useful speed, and she said yes under her breath before she could stop herself. I looked at her. "Yes, that's speed," she said. "That's grinding speed, isn't it? That's what you need. For a small family operation, yes." He closed the valve. The wheel slowed. The flow rate required is about 1/3 of what a standard mill wheel needs. Any creek with a consistent gradient will work. Haynes Creek on the ridge would work, she said. "I know," he said. "I went and looked at it last week." She looked at him. He had the slightly self-conscious expression of a man who has said something that reveals more than he intended. "You already went," she said. "I wanted to be certain before. I wanted to know it was practical before anyone else knew about it. If it doesn't work, there's no point in having told people." Eleanor understood this completely. "So it works," she said. "The calculation says yes. Then let's go tell the Harrisons." He picked up his hat from the workshop door, and they walked to the Carter stable, and he saddled 2 horses, and Eleanor had not been on a horse in 8 months. But she had grown up on one, and it came back to her the way things do that are built into the body rather than the mind. They rode north toward the ridge in the late morning heat, and Nathaniel was quiet in the way she had come to recognize as simply his natural state, not unfriendly, not distant, internal, being. "Can I ask you something?" she said, when they were out of sight of the estate. He glanced at her. "You could ask me something at the estate." "I know, I'm asking now. All right, the clocks," she said. "In your workshop. Some of them are working and some of them are taken apart. The ones that are taken apart, are you fixing them or are you studying them?" He was quiet for a moment. "The horses moved both," he said. Sometimes things need to be fixed. Sometimes I need to understand why something works before I can improve on it. Which ones are you trying to improve on? All of them, he said simply. She thought about that. That must be exhausting. He glanced at her again, and this time something in his expression shifted, surprised almost. As if he had not expected her to arrive at that particular conclusion from those particular words. Yes, he said after a moment. They rode on. The ridge came up ahead of them, and the Harrison farm appeared through the tree line, and Eleanor put the conversation away for later and focused on the work, which was what they had come for. Margaret Hollis found Eleanor at the market on Friday morning with the expression of a woman carrying news she was physically uncomfortable holding. Eleanor saw the expression and felt something tighten in her stomach. What? Charles Whitmore had supper at the Hendersons last night, Margaret said, keeping her voice low. Clara Henderson told her sister, and her sister told me. And he talked about you for 20 minutes. Margaret's eyes were steady on Eleanor's. He said that you've been seen riding to Carter Estate. That you've been corresponding by letter with Nathaniel Carter for weeks. A respectable widow wouldn't... She stopped. I don't want to repeat all of it. Then give me the summary. Margaret pressed her lips together. He said you're making yourself a fool over a man who's not right in the head, and that whatever you're hoping to get out of it, and you, because any decent family would step in before it went that far. Eleanor set down the jar she was holding. Any decent family, she said. Means George, Margaret said quietly. George and Helena. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She picked the jar back up. She placed it in exactly the right position. She said, "Thank you for telling me." Eleanor. "I'm fine," Eleanor said. "I appreciate you telling me." She was not fine, precisely, but she was also not surprised, and the gap between those two things was something she had learned to manage. What bothered her was not Whitmore's opinion. She had known that was coming. Nay. What bothered her was the phrase "any decent family would step in," because it meant that this had moved from the level of gossip to the level of action, and that meant that someone, and she could guess, who was going to say something to Nathaniel. She thought about his face when he'd talked about people receiving things better when someone they trusted brought them. She thought about the way he held himself at gatherings, the wall-like stillness of a man, braced for weather. She bought her market goods and went home and wrote a note that said, "I heard something at market this morning. I think someone may try to speak to you about our work on the water wheel project. I wanted you to know before it happened. She sent it with the postal rider before noon. His response came the following morning, earlier than usual. I know what they're saying. I've known for a week. It doesn't change anything for me. Does it change anything for you? No. His reply to that was a single line. Good. I'll have the leather handles for the sand trays by Tuesday. Carter came to Eleanor's house on a Wednesday. She was in her garden when she heard the horse on the road, and she straightened up and watched George Carter ride up to her gate with the deliberate, careful pace of a man who has thought about this visit for several days. He dismounted and tied his horse and removed his hat. A large man, broad-faced, with the easy confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt his own standing. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "You are a little," she said, "but come in." She brought him inside and gave him water and sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where she and Nathaniel had worked on the drawings, and waited. George turned his hat in his hands. He looked at her with the expression of a man who believes he is being kind. "I'll be direct," he said. "Please. My brother is not Nathaniel is not a man who understands the way things work between people," George said carefully. "Never has been. Before the war it was manageable. After," he paused, "he's a good man. I want you to know I believe that. But he gets attached to things. To projects. Ideas. And when the project ends or the idea doesn't work out," he stopped again. "You're saying he'll stop caring once the water wheel is finished," Eleanor said. She looked at her. I'm saying he doesn't always understand what he's communicating to other people. He may not realize. Mr. Carter, Eleanor said. What specifically are you asking me? The hat turned in his hands again. I'm asking you to be careful. About what you allow him to think. What I allow him to think, Eleanor said. She kept her voice entirely level. I'm not saying this to be unkind to you. What exactly do you believe Nathaniel thinks? She said. George's jaw tightened slightly. He talks about you, he said. He mentioned you 3 times in one conversation 2 weeks ago. Nathaniel doesn't mention people. He doesn't for 3 years. He has not voluntarily mentioned a person's name in conversation with me, unless I ask directly. He stopped, set the hat on the table. I'm his brother. I know what that means. Eleanor looked at him carefully. Something real in what he was saying. She could see it, not malice, not Whitmore's brand of social management. Something that was genuinely worried in the wrong direction. Mr. Carter, she said, I think you love your brother. George looked slightly surprised by this. Of course I do. No, I think you've been watching him struggle for 3 years, and it has been very hard to watch, and you have not known what to do about it. George was quiet. And I think, Eleanor said, that you have decided the problem is the people who get close to him, rather than the people who didn't. George's expression changed. The problem, Eleanor said, is not me. The problem is that for 3 years, every person in this county, including, I suspect, the people who love him, has treated him as though something is wrong with him that needs to be managed. He does not need to be managed. She held George's gaze. He needs to be trusted. George Carter stared at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that was complicated and real. Then he said very quietly, You're not what I expected. No, Eleanor said, I imagine not. He picked up his hat. He stood. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between assessment and apology, and something she thought might be relief, though she wasn't certain of that. He doesn't have many people who... He stopped himself. I hope you know what you're doing, he said. I rarely know exactly what I'm doing, Eleanor said. I know why I'm doing it. That's enough. He left. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after she heard his horse go down the road. Then she went back to her garden and stayed there until the light went. The Harrisons took the water wheel. That was how it happened, not a ceremony, not a presentation. Just a Tuesday afternoon when Nathaniel arrived at the Harrison farm with the wheel on a cart and Eleanor beside him. And together they walked Elias Harrison down to the creek and showed him the mechanism and the math behind it. And Elias Harrison, a man of 52, who had been carting grain to the mill 12 miles away 3 times a season for 20 years, looked at the turning in the creek current and said, You're telling me I can grind my own grain? That's what I'm telling you, Nathaniel said. Elias Harrison looked at Nathaniel Carter for a long moment. How much, he said. Nathaniel shook his head. I'm not selling it, he said. I'll build you one and install it. That's all. Eleanor watched something happen in Elias Harrison's face, the particular expression of a man being offered a kindness from an unexpected direction, who has learned from experience to be suspicious of unexpected kindnesses. The eyes moved to Eleanor. He means it, she said. Elias Harrison looked back at Nathaniel. Why, he said. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Because the design works, he said. Because I've been building it for 2 years, and there's no point in a design that works if it doesn't help anyone. He paused. Because the mill is 12 miles, and you have 7 children. Elias Harrison was quiet for a long time. The creek ran. The wheel turned. Finally, he said, I'll need 2 weeks to clear the bank for the installation. I know, Nathaniel said. I'll come back in 2 weeks. They rode back toward town in the late afternoon, and neither of them spoke for a while, and then Eleanor said, 7 children. He has 7 children, Nathaniel said. I know how many children Elias Harrison has, Eleanor said. I'm asking how you knew. I asked around, Nathaniel said. Before I went to look at the creek, I wanted to know who was on the ridge before I went up there. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead with that careful, steady attention he gave to most things. You research the families, she said. I like to understand a situation before I walk into it, he said. Odine, she said. He glanced at her. The corner of his mouth moved the not-quite smile she was becoming familiar with. I know, he said. She faced forward again. The road was dusty in the summer heat, and the horses moved easily beneath them. Yeah. She was aware, in a way that she couldn't entirely organize into thought, of how comfortable this was, this specific silence, this specific distance between them, this specific quality of attention. She had not had a companion in 2 years. She had not realized how much she missed the weight of another person's presence until the weight was there again. Can I ask you something, he said. She recognized her own words from 2 weeks ago. You could have asked at the Harrison farm, she said. No, I'm asking now. All right, a pause. The road went on. Your husband, he said, James Whitfield. What was he like? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. It was not a painful question, exactly. It was more that it was a question no one in the county asked her anymore. People in the county treated James Whitfield's memory as a territory she should be left alone in, which she had come to understand was a form of courtesy that was also a form of distance. Steady, she said. He was steady. He worked hard, and he was honest, and he was kind in a consistent, undramatic way. He wasn't a man of grand gestures. He remembered things. What you'd mentioned once, what mattered to you. He paid attention. She paused. That's rarer than it sounds, yes, Nathaniel said. It is. She looked at him. He was still watching the road, but something in the quality of his attention had shifted more inward. You miss having someone pay attention, he said. It was not quite a question. I miss a lot of things, she said. But yes, that specifically. She kept her voice even. What about you? What about me? Was there ever before the war? Was there someone? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, there was someone I thought I would marry. Before. We had an understanding. A pause. When I came back from the war, the understanding was no longer mutual. Eleanor heard what was beneath, that the careful, flattened way he said it, the particular compression of a pain that had been pressed very thin over time. I'm sorry, she said. It was a long time ago, he said. Doesn't always make it smaller. He glanced at her. Something in his face was very still, the particular stillness of someone who has just been given an accurate thing and doesn't quite know where to put it. No, he said quietly. It doesn't. It was Charles Whitmore who brought it to a point. He waited 3 weeks long enough that Eleanor had almost begun to believe he'd decided to let it go, which she knew even as she thought it was wishful thinking. Whitmore was not a man who let things go. He was a man who waited for the right moment. He found his moment on a Sunday after church. Nathaniel had come to church that week, which was unusual enough that the whole congregation noticed and noted it. He had sat in the back pew with George on one side and an empty space on the other where Eleanor had, entirely by coincidence or not at all by coincidence, been seated by Margaret Hollis, who had the innocent expression of a woman who had engineered a completely accidental seating arrangement. After the service, in the churchyard, while people were doing what people did in Kentucky yards on Sunday mornings, Whitmore came to stand beside Eleanor with a cup from the refreshment table and the cordial expression of a man about to deliver something in a friendly wrapper. Mrs. Whitfield, he said. Lovely morning, Mr. Whitmore. I hear you've been busy, he said. Up on the ridge. Harrison farm. I have been, she said. Good work, Whitmore said pleasantly. Good to see the community looking after its own. He let that sit for a moment. Of course, people have been wondering how best to describe your involvement with Carter's project. Whether it's charity work or something more personal. Eleanor looked at him directly. I imagine people can describe it however suits them, she said. The thing is, Nan, Whitmore said, dropping the pleasantness by about half, that Nathaniel Carter is a man with a significant estate. And an unmarried woman of limited means who spends considerable time at that estate. He paused. Well, people will draw conclusions, and conclusions once drawn affect more than just the individuals involved. Are you threatening me, Mr. Whitmore? I'm advising you, he said. As someone with this county's interests at heart. Whose interest, specifically? He smiled. It did not reach his eyes at all. The Carter family's stability is important to this county, he said. George Carter agrees with me on this, I believe. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. She was aware of her own pulse, steady and deliberate, and she thought about how easy it would be to step back, to agree, to perform the deference he expected and believed he'd already secured. She thought about Patience writing her name in the sand. She thought about Elias Harrison's face when the wheel turned in the creek. She thought about a note in cramped handwriting that said, "Your students are fortunate." Mr. Whitmore, she said, I appreciate the advice. I'll give it exactly the consideration it deserves. She picked up her own lemonade. Now, if you'll excuse me. She walked away. She walked directly to where Nathaniel was standing at the edge of the churchyard with George slightly apart from the main crowd in his habitual way. Saw her coming, and something moved in his expression, wariness or relief. She couldn't tell which. Nathaniel saw her face. What happened, he said. Nothing I couldn't handle, she said. But I think you should know that Charles Whitmore has decided our work on the ridge is a threat to county stability. Nathaniel looked past her toward where Whitmore was standing. His jaw tightened. What did he say to you? Nothing specific enough to respond to directly, she said. That's how he operates. It's always adjacent. Nothing you can pick up and hold. H said. Carefully. But Eleanor. George, Nathaniel said. His voice was quiet, entirely quiet. But something in it had changed. It had a different quality from his usual quiet, not contained but deliberate. Was this looked at him? Was what my idea? Whitmore, Nathaniel said, talking to her. Was that something you asked him to do? George's face went through several things in quick succession. I mentioned to him that I was concerned about George. Nathaniel's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Did you ask Whitmore to approach Eleanor? A beat of silence. I mentioned to him, George said carefully, that I thought the situation deserved some careful. Yes or no, Nathaniel said. George looked at his brother. Something in his face tightened and then slowly released. I mentioned it, he said quietly. I didn't ask him to. I didn't tell him to. You mentioned it to a man you know very well, Nathaniel said. And you know how he handles things people mention to him. George said nothing. Nathaniel turned back to Eleanor. His eyes met hers, and she could see the effort it was taking him not to contain anger, but to continue standing in a churchyard in front of the community he'd been performing calm for since he came home from the war. I'm sorry, he said. You shouldn't have had to deal with that. I handled it, she said. I know you did, he said. I'm sorry anyway. She looked at him. She thought about George saying he doesn't have many people who end stopping himself. She thought about the note on her doorstep, the sand trays, the cramped handwriting, the question about James. She thought about what it cost a man like Nathaniel Carter to stand in a churchyard and say that out loud when everyone was watching. Come have supper, she said. Both of you. George blinked. Nathaniel held very still for a moment. Then all right. George looked between them. He stopped. Yes, he said. And he sounded, Eleanor thought, somewhat like a man who is beginning to understand that he has been wrong about something and is not yet sure what to do about it. Yes, thank you. Supper was bread and summer vegetables and the last of the preserved ham, which was not elegant but was good. And Eleanor set the table, and Nathaniel appeared at her door with a jar of honey from the Carter estate's hives, and George appeared 10 minutes after, with a look on his face like a man attending something he wasn't sure he'd been invited to but had come anyway, out of sheer stubbornness. They ate. It was not comfortable at first. George was careful in his speech. Nathaniel was quiet in his usual way. Eleanor asked George direct questions about the mill, how it worked, who used it, what the bottleneck was in peak season, because she had found that direct questions were the best antidote to the kind of strained politeness that could calcify a meal into misery. George answered. And then he asked Nathaniel something about the water wheel mechanism, a technical question. And Nathaniel answered, and George asked another question. Eleanor watched the two of them talk, really talk. Brothers who knew each other's thinking talked, and she saw something she had not been sure she would see. George Carter was proud of his brother. Under everything, under the worry and the misguided management, and the Whitmore conversation that she was absolutely not going to pretend had not happened, there was a genuine, complicated pride. He asked about the Harrison installation with real interest. He asked about the other families on the ridge. When Nathaniel described the modification he'd made to the drip shaft based on Eleanor's creek measurements, George looked at Eleanor with an expression she recognized as recalibration. You took the creek measurements, George said. He needed the gradient data, Eleanor said. I knew the method. Surveyor, she said. I learned young. George looked at Nathaniel. Something passed between them that Eleanor couldn't read entirely but felt the weight of. Then George looked back at Eleanor and said, I owe you an apology. You owe me an accurate assessment of the situation going forward, Eleanor said. The apology can be implied. George Carter laughed. A real laugh, surprised, involuntary, the kind that breaks out of a person before they can decide whether to allow it. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor with the expression she had come to think of as specifically his, that almost smile with something deeper running underneath it. Something she was not yet ready to name, but was becoming increasingly aware she would have to. After George left warmer than he'd arrived, though still carrying the residue of a man in the process of changing his mind, Eleanor and Nathaniel stood on her porch in the thick summer dark. And the cicadas were loud, and the air was heavy and still. You didn't have to invite George, he said. I know. Doesn't he means well? He doesn't always. Nathaniel, she said. He stopped. I know, she said. He was quiet. The dark was very thick around them, and the nearest light was the lamp through the window behind her. She could see face in that limited light, the scar along his jaw, the careful steadiness she had come to find not unnerving but deeply, specifically reassuring. People are going to keep saying things, she said. About this. He gestured between them, a small, precise gesture. I can't, he stopped. I'm not in a position to stop that. I know, she said. It might get worse, he said. Before it might get worse. Most things do, she said, before they get better. He looked at her for a long moment. The cicadas screamed from the trees. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked and went quiet. Why, he said. It came out quieter than he intended. She could hear that from the way it landed. It was the question underneath all the other questions, the one he'd been not asking for weeks. Why any of this? Why come to the gathering? Why the note? Why Elias Harrison? Because the sand tray worked, she said. He looked at her. Because you built 6 of them before I was awake, she said. Because Patience wrote her name. Because Elias Harrison has 7 children, and you knew that before you went to his farm. Stopped. Steadied herself. Because the first time I saw you, were fixing a child's toy in the middle of a room full of people laughing at you, and you did it without making a single thing of it, and I thought that is a person who understands what matters. The stillness that came over him was a different kind from all the others she had catalogued. This one was not containment. This one was something caught, the particular stillness of receiving something they had stopped expecting. Eleanor, he said. Her name in his voice had a quality she was not prepared for. Not unkindly. Not yet. After a moment, he nodded. A single, careful nod. The Piketts on the ridge, she said. They have a smaller creek than the Harrisons. Would the wheel work? He was quiet for a moment, letting the shift happen, following her lead. Possibly, he said. I'd need to measure the flow. I know where the Pikett creak is, she said. I know you do, he said. She went inside. She closed the door. She leaned against it in the warm dark of her kitchen and listened to his footsteps go down her porch steps and along the road, and she waited until she could no longer hear them. Then she went to the kitchen drawer and opened it, and the first note was still there. Your students are fortunate. And she closed the drawer and stood there for a long moment and thought about all the things she was not yet ready to say. Bad time. Nah. She believed that, in the way you believe things that are not yet certain but feel, in the specific weight of them. Elred, true. They had time, and Charles Whitmore had just made his first move. The letter arrived on a Monday. Eleanor found it on her kitchen table, not on the doorstep, not slipped under the door on the table, which meant someone had come inside while she was in the garden, which meant someone had walked into her home without knocking, without asking, without the basic courtesy that even strangers extended to each other in Harlan County. She stood in her kitchen doorway and looked at the envelope for a long moment before she touched it. It was fine paper, expensive, the kind of paper that announced itself before you opened it. Her name was written on the front, in a hand she didn't recognize. Liberate. She opened it. It was from Eleanor Carter. Not George. Helena. It was 3 paragraphs long and written in the measured, careful tone of a woman who had composed and recomposed something until every sharp edge was smoothed to a surface that could not be directly objected to. The first paragraph expressed hope that Eleanor was well and that the summer had been kind. The second paragraph noted, with gentle concern, that the nature of Eleanor's relationship with Nathaniel had become a topic of significant discussion in the county, and that such discussion was, regrettably, the kind that reflected on all parties involved. The third paragraph suggested, not requested, suggests that Eleanor might wish to consider whether her continued involvement in Nathaniel's projects was, in the long run, truly in his best interest. Given his particular difficulties with social situations and his tendency to form attachments that he was not always well equipped to manage. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original creases and set it on the table and went back to her garden and pulled weeds for 40 minutes until her hands stopped wanting to shake. She was not surprised. That was the thing she kept returning to. She was not surprised, and the not being surprised was its own kind of grief, because it meant she had known this was coming, and had come anyway. And now she was standing in the middle of it, and the ground was exactly as unsteady as she'd known it would be. Went back inside. She sat at the table. She picked up the letter again. His tendency to form attachments he is not always well equipped to manage. She thought about Nathaniel's hands, building 6 sand trays in the dark, before she woke up. She thought about him standing in Elias Harrison's field with his hat in his hands and 7 children counted and accounted for before he ever walked through that gate. She thought about the cramped handwriting, slightly less cramped over the weeks, the letters arriving faster, the questions getting more direct, more real. He was not forming an unmanageable attachment. He was the most deliberate, careful, considered person she had encountered in years. Every step he took was measured. Every word he offered was chosen. He was not failing to manage himself. He was managing himself more carefully than most people managed anything. Eleanor Carter was not describing Nathaniel. She was describing what she feared he might if someone she hadn't approved of was allowed to keep standing next to him. Eleanor put the letter in the kitchen drawer, not beside the note that said, "Your students are fortunate." On the other side of the drawer, separate, because they did not belong in the same category. Then she wrote a note to Nathaniel. It said, "Helena wrote to me. I think you should know. I'm not going anywhere, but I think you should know." She sent it before she could reconsider the last 4 words. He came that afternoon. Not a note this time. He came himself, riding up the road at a pace that was not quite urgent, but was not his usual deliberate either. Eleanor met him on the porch, and he looked at her face and said, "Show me the letter." She showed him the letter. He read it. He read it the way he read technical documents, entirely still, giving the words his full attention, not reacting until he'd finished. When he looked up, his jaw was set in a way she had not seen before. "I didn't know she wrote to you," he said. "I assumed that." He'd stopped. "George and I spoke last week. I told him I wasn't going to pull back from the ridge work." Told him. He set the letter on the table with the careful, controlled gesture of a man not permitting himself to do what he would prefer to do with a piece of paper. I thought we'd reached an understanding." "George may have reached an understanding," Eleanor said. "Helena may have reached a different one." He looked at her. "Nah, are you all right?" Question caught her off guard, which annoyed her slightly. She had been prepared for conversation about the letter, about Helena, about strategy. Not been prepared for him to ask about her first. "I'm fine," she said. Eleanor. She looked at him. Nay. He was looking at her with the direct, steady attention that she had learned was simply how he engaged with things he considered important. And something about being on the receiving end of that attention made the careful composure she'd been maintaining since the morning feel somewhat less sturdy. "It's not the letter," she said. "The letter I can manage. She stopped, found the words. "It's the fact that someone walked into my house to leave it. While I was in the garden, someone came into my home." Face went very still. "Who?" "Helena wouldn't come herself. One of the Carter house staff, probably, or..." She paused. "Or Whitmore sent someone." The stillness in his face shifted into something harder. "A different thing from a letter," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. I'm going," he started, and then stopped himself with visible effort. "I want to go to Whitmore right now." Another stop. He turned and stood at the edge of her porch with his back to her for a moment, the line of his shoulders tight, with the effort of not doing the thing he wanted to do. Then he turned back. "That won't help you," he said. "If I confront him, it becomes a different kind of story." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't go myself." He looked at her. "You thought about going yourself?" "For about 10 minutes," she said. "Then I pulled weeds." The corner of his mouth moved, not all the way to the almost smile, but close. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll speak to George tonight," he said. "About Helena. About whoever came into your house." "That will not happen again." "Nathaniel, that will not happen again," he said. Quiet. Final. Not a threat, a statement of fact about something he had decided. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what it had cost him to stand in that churchyard on Sunday and say, "I'm sorry" out loud, in front of people. She thought about the careful, practiced way he held himself together in public spaces, the wall-like stillness that was not monotonous, but it. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. Then he nodded and picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the porch railing. "Paquette Creek," he said. "Are you free Thursday?" "I'm free Thursday," she said. He rode away. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen and thought about the word anywhere in the note she'd sent him, and what it had meant when she wrote it and what it meant now. And she decided she had been right to write it, and she was not going to reconsider it. Thursday came. They rode to the Pickett farm, measured the creek, and Ezra Pickett, a man of 60, who had the weathered permanent skepticism of someone who had been disappointed by enough promises to distrust all new ones, watched Nathaniel measure the water flow with a stick and a counting method and asked, "What do you want for it?" "Nothing," Nathaniel said. Ezra Pickett said, "Men don't give away things that work." "What do you actually want?" Nathaniel looked at him. "I want the design to work," he said. "If it works at your creek, I'll know it works for small flow sources." "That's what I get." Ezra Pickett looked at Eleanor. "You always like this?" "In my experience, yes," Eleanor said. Ezra Pickett grunted. He looked back at the creek. He looked back at Nathaniel. "Weeks, same as Harrison?" "2 weeks," Nathaniel said. On the way back, they passed the north road that led toward the Whitmore's estate, and Nathaniel's posture shifted slightly, a small automatic tension, and then released as they moved past it. Eleanor watched this happen and said nothing about it. Can I tell you something? She said. You're going to tell me something regardless, he said. You know me too well for 6 weeks, she said. I pay attention, he said. She took a breath. I've been thinking about the children I teach, she said. About what happens when I can no longer see them in the mornings. When winter comes and the money for the heating and I don't have a reliable space. The widow Haynes lets me use her parlor, but she's going to be moving to her daughter's in Lexington by October, and I haven't found another arrangement. He was quiet. She could feel him thinking not the social thinking of a person formulating a response, but the real, structural thinking of a person solving a problem. How many children? 7 now, she said. And 3 more families who've asked about winter. Estate has a room, he said, east of the workshop. It was going to be a second workshop, but I haven't started on it. It has 2 windows and a fireplace. Eleanor looked at him. Nathaniel. It would need to be cleaned out, he said. There's some lumber stored there. But the structures is sound and the fireplace draws well. I checked it last winter. You checked the fireplace last winter, she said. I check all the fireplaces, he said. It's a large house. If one draws poorly, it affects the heat distribution throughout the... He stopped. He had the slightly self-conscious look of a man who has over-explained something. The room is available, he said simply, if you want it. Eleanor looked at the road ahead. People will have a great deal to say about that, she said. I'm aware, more than they're already saying. I'm aware of that too, he said. Glanced at her. You said other people's theories about your motivations are their business, not yours. Did say that. I believed you when you said it, he said. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. He nodded. They rode on, and in the specific waited silence between them, Eleanor felt something shifting, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, inevitable way of ground settling after long rain. XFJF that changes the shape of a landscape quietly over time, until one day you look up and realize the topography is entirely different from what it was. She was not sure she was ready for that. She was not sure she had a choice. The county meeting was George Carter's idea, and it was, Eleanor came to understand afterward, the worst idea George Carter had ever had, which was saying something given the Whitmore supper conversation. The county held regular meetings at the courthouse, practical affairs, mostly dealing with road maintenance and property boundaries and mill rates. George had requested time at the August meeting to present Nathaniel's water wheel design to the county at large. Argument being that several families on the ridge could benefit from the information, and a formal presentation would carry more weight than word of mouth. Nathaniel had agreed, reluctantly. Eleanor had said she thought it was a good idea, which in retrospect she recognized as being too generous in her assessment of George Carter's political instincts. The courthouse was full. Harlan County did not pass up an opportunity to gather, and a Carter presenting at a county meeting was unusual enough to draw people who had no particular interest in water wheels. Eleanor sat in the 3rd row beside Margaret Hollis, who had the tense, alert posture of a woman prepared to be useful in an emergency. Nathaniel stood at the front of the room, with his drawings pinned to a board behind him. He was not comfortable. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, not fear. Not the war-born hypervigilance she had learned to recognize in the way he sometimes tracked movement at the edges of rooms, but the specific discomfort of a person in a performance situation who has had to learn performance the hard way, through failure, and who does not trust his own capacity for it. He started speaking, and he was good. That was the thing that surprised the room, not Eleanor, who had spent in his workshops and on his rides and at his kitchen table, learning what he was capable of, but the room. He spoke clearly, without the halting stops and overcomplications she might have expected. Are they? Because he was talking about something he understood completely, and when a person understands something completely, the words come differently. He explained the design. He explained the flow calculations. He explained the installation process and the expected output and the families on the ridge who had already installed or agreed to install. When he mentioned the Harrison installation, Elias Harrison, sitting in the fifth row, made a sound of affirmation that was not quite a word but communicated clearly. It works. I'm using it. This is real. The room shifted. Eleanor felt it, the quality of attention changing from skeptical to interested, from interested to engaged. Then Charles Whitmore raised his hand. He waited to be acknowledged, which he was, because he was Charles Whitmore and rooms acknowledged him. He stood. He had the ease of a man who has been performing in public for decades and has never once doubted his reception. Impressive work, he said, with the particular warmth of a man loading a compliment. Harder ingenuity has always been. He paused, just long enough. My question is about liability. If a family on the ridge installs one of these mechanisms, and someone is injured, a child, say, who bears responsibility? Carter Estate? The family themselves? Because we're talking about machinery installed on private property by a man with no formal engineering credentials, and I think it's responsible to raise the question of what happens when a mechanism has no moving parts accessible to a child, Nathaniel said. Whitmore stopped. The drive shaft is housed, Nathaniel continued, his voice still entirely level. The gear mechanism is enclosed. The only accessible component is the wheel itself, which turns at a speed of approximately, he quoted the number, which is slower than a wagon wheel in motion. If the county is concerned about liability for children near wagon wheels, I'd be delighted to discuss that at a separate meeting. A sound moved through the room. Not laughter, exactly, but the sound a crowd makes when something lands that they didn't expect. Whitmore's pleasant expression tightened by a fraction. Be that as it may, he said, there's also the question of whether there's an appropriate use of county resources. No county resources are involved, Nathaniel said. I build and install at my own expense. The materials come from my estate. The labor is mine. The county is involved only in this room right now, and only because George thought it would be useful for families to know the option exists. He looked at Whitmore with the direct, steady attention he gave to everything. Was there a specific technical question? Another sound from the room. This one had an edge of appreciation in it. Whitmore sat down. Eleanor watched his face as he sat, and she saw something there that she had not seen before in the 6 weeks she'd been paying attention to Charles Whitmore, a flash of genuine anger. Not the managed, tactical irritation of a man redirecting a situation to his advantage, actual anger. The kind that comes from miscalculation. He had expected Nathaniel Carter to falter at the front of that room. He had expected the man the county knew silent, edge-dwelling, easy to unsettle, and he had gotten something else entirely. She thought, he is going to do something about this. Was right. The something happened 4 days later. Timing. Margaret Hollis arrived at Eleanor's door in the early morning with the expression she wore when the news was bad enough that she had walked the half-mile from her house without stopping to consider whether it was the right time to call. There's a document, Margaret said, before Eleanor had fully opened the door. Eleanor opened the door the rest of the way. Come in. Margaret came in. She sat at the kitchen table with the posture of a woman who has been carrying something heavy and is relieved to set it down. Whitmore filed something with the county clerk's office yesterday afternoon, she said. Aunt Miss Hollis saw it when he went in about the Henderson boundary matter. He told me last night. Eleanor sat down across from her. What kind of document? A petition, Margaret said. Requesting that the county review the terms under which mechanical improvements are installed on private property within county limits without formal inspection. Inciting concerns about, I'm quoting Thomas here, unverified engineering practices and potential risk to county residents, particularly those in vulnerable economic circumstances, who may not possess the knowledge to assess such risks themselves. Eleanor was very still. It doesn't name Nathaniel directly, Margaret said. But Thomas says everyone in the clerk's office understood exactly what it was about. It doesn't need to name him, Eleanor said. If the county adopts the petition, Any future installation requires a formal inspection. And who does Whitmore propose for the inspection committee? Margaret's expression told her she already knew the answer. He's proposed himself, Eleanor said, and two of his business associates. Ip says Whitmore spent the morning before filing talking to County Commissioner Aldridge, Margaret said. They had a private meeting. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. The petition was clever. She could see the architecture of it clearly, the way Whitmore had constructed it to be objectively reasonable on its face. A document about safety and county standards that no one could object to directly without appearing to advocate for unsafe practices. It did not say stop Nathaniel Carter. It said establish oversight. But the oversight it established would be controlled by Whitmore, and it would require Nathaniel to seek approval from the man who had been publicly embarrassed by him twice now, once in the Whitmore garden and once in the county courthouse. It was not about the water wheels. It was about making Nathaniel Carter need Charles Whitmore's permission for something. Does Nathaniel know? Eleanor said. I came here first, Margaret said. Didn't know. I thought you should. She stopped. I didn't know if you'd want me to tell him. Eleanor looked at her friend. Of course I want him to know, she said. Margaret's expression did something complicated. Eleanor. Be careful. I am being careful, Eleanor said. Being careful doesn't mean standing aside while someone builds a wall around him. She rode to Carter Estate inside the hour. Nathaniel was in the workshop. He heard her come in, and he turned from the work table and he read her face the way he read everything thoroughly, immediately, and he set down the tool in his hand. What happened, he said. She told him. The petition. The committee. The meeting with Aldridge. The clerk's office. She told him clearly, and without softening it, because she had learned in 6 weeks that he did not want things softened, that the softening was what insulted him, not the difficulty. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He's not wrong, he said. She stared at him. I beg your pardon. The inspection principle, Nathaniel said. Formally, if a man is installing mechanical equipment on a neighbor's property, there should be a process for verifying it's safe. Itself is sound. He paused. The committee is the problem. The committee is the entire point, Eleanor said. I know that. He turned back to the work table. I need to think. Nay, waited. But stood at the table with his hands flat on the surface and his head down, and she recognized this as his actual thinking posture, not performing consideration, not managing a reaction, but genuinely working through a problem with the full concentration he brought to gear ratios and flow calculations. There's a county surveyor, he said, finally. Marsh. Daniel Marsh. He retired 2 years ago. He's 71, and he spent 40 years assessing structural engineering for the county. He looked up. If the petition creates an inspection requirement, the question is who sits on the committee. Whitmore has proposed 3 members. The petition goes to the full county meeting for approval. If I can get 3 alternate nominations to the commissioner before the petition is formally reviewed. Aldridge already met with Whitmore, Eleanor said. Aldridge met with Whitmore, Nathaniel said. He hasn't committed to anything yet. If he had committed, there would be no petition, it would already be done. He looked at her steadily. He's leaving a door open. Eleanor thought about this. Aldridge has a daughter on the East Ridge, she said slowly. Allen's, Mary Allen. Her husband has been carting grain to the mill for 3 seasons. Nathaniel looked at her. She has 4 children, Eleanor said. Because I've been asked twice whether I can fit 2 more into the teaching sessions. Shifted in Nathaniel's expression. Eleanor. The Harrison installation has been running for 3 weeks, she said. If Commissioner Aldridge were to see it functioning. If Elias Harrison were to explain what it saves his family in time and money. If Mary Allen's husband were to mention what a closer milling option would mean for the Eastridge families. You're suggesting I go to Aldridge directly, Nathaniel said. I'm suggesting, Eleanor said, That we go to Aldrich directly. N. That we bring Elias Harrison with us. And that we ask Daniel Marsh if he'd be willing to serve on an inspection committee so that when we walk into that conversation, we're not asking for protection, we're presenting an alternative. N. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at her with the expression she had learned to read as the one that came just before he said something true. You planned this on the way here, he said. I planned most of it, she said. Aldridge's daughter was an addition. You knew about Mary Allen before today. I've been teaching her oldest boy since May, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, I'll write to Marsh today. I'll call on Mary Allen this afternoon, she said. He moved to his writing shelf and pulled paper. He paused. Eleanor. She was already at the workshop door. She turned. Thank you, he said. Not the reflexive courtesy of a man acknowledging assistance. The word had weight in its specific gravity. Thank patience, she said. She's the one who needs the East Ridge family's children in better schools. Meeting with Commissioner Aldridge happened on a Friday, 5 days after the petition filing. Nathaniel had written to Daniel Marsh, who had responded with the alacrity of a 71-year-old man who had been bored for 2 years and was delighted to be useful. Marsh had agreed not only to serve on an inspection committee, but to write a formal letter to the commissioner's office affirming that Nathaniel's water wheel design met or exceeded all structural safety standards he was aware of. In his 40 years of county engineering assessment, Eleanor had called on Mary Allen, who had listened to the situation with the focused attention of a woman who had been waiting for someone to give her a reason to have this particular conversation with her father. I'll talk to him, Mary Allen had said. I've been talking to him about the East Ridge for 2 years. He listens. She eventually. Elias Harrison came of his own accord. On a horse he rode 12 miles in the August heat and arrived at the commissioner's office 20 minutes before the meeting because, he said, when a man spent 20 years carting grain 12 miles 3 times a season and someone offered him a better way, the least he could do was show up. Commissioner Aldridge was a careful man. He listened to all of it, Nathaniel's formal presentation of the design, Daniel Marsh's letter read aloud by Nathaniel, Elias Harrison's account of 3 weeks of functioning installation, Mary Allen's quiet and specific description of what the East Ridge families needed. He asked questions. They answered them. Then he looked at Nathaniel and said, Carter. I'm going to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer. Yes, sir, Nathaniel said. Is this about the wheel, or is this about Whitmore? Nathaniel held the commissioner's gaze. The wheel design is real, he said. Installations are real. The benefit to the Ridge families is real. Whether Charles Whitmore's petition was motivated by concerns about safety standards or by something else is a question I'll leave to your judgment. A pause. But I do think the county deserves an inspection committee that represents the county's interest rather than one man's. Aldridge looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the room throughout the meeting. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, what's your interest in all of this? Every head in the room turned toward her. Eleanor met the commissioner's gaze directly. 7 children, she said. Counting 2 I'm hoping to add in the fall. They need a real schoolroom. Mr. Carter has offered a room on his estate. But more than that, they need families on the Ridge with enough time and enough income to think about education instead of just survival. That's what the water wheel's about. She paused. That's what all of this is about if you want the honest version. Commissioner Aldridge looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. Then he looked at the letter from Daniel Marsh. Then he said, I'll be appointing a 5-member inspection committee. 3 of those members will be from my office's existing advisory structure. F2 will be community nominations, 1 from the petition filer and 1 from the affected property owners. He stood. Carter, I'd recommend you collect your nominations before the end of the week. Nathaniel stood. Thank you, Commissioner. Aldridge was already moving toward the door. He He paused. He looked back at Nathaniel with the expression of a man who has assessed a situation and reached a conclusion he hadn't expected to reach. "That water wheel," he said. "The one at Harrison's." "Actually work?" "Ask Elias Harrison," Nathaniel said. Elias Harrison, from his chair in the corner, said, "Hasn't stopped since we put it in." Aldridge made a sound that was not quite a word and walked out. They rode home separately, Elias Harrison back toward the ridge, Mary Allen to her house, Daniel Marsh to his, and Eleanor and Nathaniel together along the road toward town, which turned toward her house before it turned toward his. "It worked," Nathaniel said. He said it quietly, with the particular tone of a man who had prepared for it not to work and was still adjusting to the alternative. "It worked," Eleanor agreed. "Whitmore will try something else," he said. "He will," she said. "I don't know what." "No," she said. "We'll handle it." He looked at her. Yeah. She was looking at the road ahead, and she could feel his gaze the way you feel weather changing, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific quality of the air, something shifting in the pressure of things. "Eleanor," he said. "Nathaniel," she said. "I need to tell you something," he said. She turned to look at him. He was not looking at the road. He was looking at her with the direct, entirely serious attention that she had learned was how he looked at things he considered most important, and something in her chest did a thing she did not entirely have language for. "My brother is going to ask you to come to the estate for supper on Sunday," he said. "George. He's trying. He told me yesterday that he wanted to. He said he thought he'd misjudged the situation." He paused. "I told him that was a significant understatement." Eleanor felt something in the corner of her mouth threaten to move. "What did he say?" "Yes, probably." Another pause. "Helena will be there. I can't promise that will be comfortable." "I can manage uncomfortable," Eleanor said. "I know you can," he said. "I just wanted—" He stopped. He had the look of a man who is trying to say something precisely and cannot find the precise version. "I wanted you to know that I know it's not simple. What you're doing. What it costs you. I'm not—" He stopped again. "I see it," he said finally. "I want you to know I see it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The road went on. The August heat pressed down on everything, and the cicadas were already starting in the trees, and somewhere ahead a hawk called once and went quiet. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I'm here." He held her gaze for a beat. "Nan." Then he looked forward again. Something in the line of his shoulders was different, not the absence of tension, exactly, but tension that had changed its quality, from resistance to something more like readiness. "And then," he said. "Sunday," she said. She turned at her road, and he continued toward his, and she did not look back, but she listened the way she'd learned to listen. In the weeks since his footsteps first went down her porch steps, and along the road until she couldn't hear the sound of his horse anymore. Went inside. She went to the kitchen drawer. She opened it. Note was still there. "Your students are fortunate." Still on one side. Helena's letter on the other. The distance between them felt both very small and very large, the way the distance between things always feels when you're standing exactly at the point where they could go either way. She closed the drawer. Sunday was 4 days away. Helena Carter was going to look at her across a formal supper table, with the expression of a woman deciding whether to open a door or wall it off permanently. And Charles Whitmore, somewhere on the North Ridge, was sitting in his fine house on his fine land, calculating what he had lost in Commissioner Aldridge's office and what he was going to do about it. Eleanor had been right, that morning in her garden, after reading Helena's letter. Ground was unsteady, and it was about to get more so. Came. The way difficult things always come, preceded by a night that was too long and a morning that was too bright, and no amount of preparation made the thing itself feel prepared for. Eleanor wore the blue cotton dress again, not because it was her best. It was her only good one, but because she had worn it the night of the Whitmore gathering, which felt like the right kind of continuity. She did her hair carefully, which she did not always do on Sundays, And she told herself this was not because of Helena Carter, and then admitted that it was partly because of Helena Carter, and then decided that was a reasonable thing to admit and moved on. She arrived at Carter Estate at 6 o'clock, as George's note had specified. Nathaniel met her at the gate, which meant he had been watching for her, which meant he had been standing near a window for some amount of time before 6 o'clock. And the thought of that sat warmly in her chest in a way she didn't examine too closely. Eleanor knows what she said in the letter, he said quietly, walking beside her toward the house. I told her directly. She knows I know. She knows you know I know. How did she take that? Quietly, he said. Eleanor takes most things quietly and then processes them for several days before responding. You've been processing since Tuesday. And George? George is trying very hard, Nathaniel said. He's been trying very hard since your kitchen table. Give him credit for that. I do, Eleanor said. I'll give Helena credit when she earns it. Something in his expression shifted appreciation, she thought, for the honesty of it. He held the door open, and she walked through into the Carter house for the first time. It was large and spare in the way she had expected the bones of a family home inhabited by one person, the furniture good and old, the spaces between things larger than they needed to be. But there were details she had not expected. A bookshelf covering most of one wall, so full that books had been stacked horizontally on top of vertical rows. A small mechanical contraption on the hall table that turned slowly in some internal draft, purely decorative, she realized, or as close to decorative as Nathaniel came. And drawings pinned to the wall of the back hallway. Technical drawings, yes, but also 3 small sketches that were not technical at all: a horse in a field, a creek scene from above, and what looked like a child's hand holding a stick. She stopped at the last one. Patience, she said. No steps passed her before he realized she'd stopped. He came back. He looked at the sketch on the wall and then at her. I was testing a new graphite, he said. I needed something to draw. She looked at the sketch for another moment. Then she kept walking. George met them in the hallway, with the energy of a man who had been managing his own nervousness for several hours and had arrived at a forced, slightly brittle cheerfulness that Eleanor recognized as genuine effort and appreciated accordingly. He shook her hand and thanked her for coming, and said the kitchen had been working since noon, which was probably true and was definitely meant as a peace offering. Helena Carter was in the sitting room. She was 43, slim, with the kind of composed elegance that came not from ease but from long practice. She had the Carter family's dark eyes, and none of their tendency toward stillness where Nathaniel was contained. Helena was controlled, which was a different thing. She rose when Eleanor entered the room, and there was a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, in which both women looked at each other with the direct assessment of people who have already formed opinions through intermediaries and are now seeing whether the original materials matches the account. Mrs. Whitfield, Helena said. Mrs. Carter, Eleanor said. They sat. George said something about the meal being nearly ready and disappeared in the direction of the kitchen, with the relief of a man removing himself from artillery range. Nathaniel sat beside Eleanor, not close enough to be remarkable, but close enough that his presence was a steady, deliberate fact. Eleanor said, I understand you've been doing significant work on the ridge. Nathaniel has been doing significant work on the ridge, Eleanor said. I've been making introductions and measuring creek gradients. Helena's expression registered the correction, without showing whether she found it honest or tactical. The children you teach, she said. Nathaniel mentioned a room on the east wing. Offered it, Eleanor said. I see. A pause. That would bring you to the estate regularly. It would bring the children to the estate regularly, Eleanor said. I would accompany them. Helena looked at her. Then she did something Eleanor had not expected. She laughed. It was brief, and it had a complex sound to it, not entirely warm but not cold either. You're very precise, she said. I find it saves time, Eleanor said. Yes. Helena looked down at her hands for a moment. Up again. Mrs. Whitfield. I think the letter I sent was. She stopped. Again. The manner in which it was delivered was not acceptable. Knew it when I did it and I did it anyway. That was wrong. Eleanor held her gaze. Yes, she said. It was. Helena's jaw tightened slightly at the directness of this. It released it. I was afraid, she said. And this came out differently from everything else she'd said, less controlled, more real. The word carrying actual weight. I have watched Nathaniel for 3 years and I have not, neither George nor I have known how to. She stopped. You've been trying to protect him, Eleanor said. Yes. From the wrong things, Eleanor said. Not unkindly. Helena was quiet for a moment. Possibly, she said. It was not an apology, it was not absolute. Was a door, slightly open, which was more than Eleanor had expected from this conversation and enough to work with. She thought about what Nathaniel had said. Helena takes most things quietly and processes them, and she decided that this was Helena, having processed, offering what she was currently capable of offering. The children come on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, Eleanor said. If the room works for them, I'd like to add a Friday session by October. Helena looked at her for a moment. I'll have the room cleared by Monday, she said. George reappeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who has been listening through a wall and is relieved by what he heard. He said. Everything's ready. They went to supper. It was not a comfortable meal. It was, however, a real one, real, in the way that meals are real, when people are not performing for each other, but actually sitting in the same room and trying, with varying degrees of success, to find the ground between them. George asked Eleanor questions about her father, the surveyor, and she answered, and Nathaniel added something technical about surveying methods that led George into a story about a property boundary dispute the mill had been involved in, which led Helena to describe the negotiation that had resolved it, and Eleanor listened to the three of them talk and thought, this is what this family sounds like when it's not bracing against itself. After supper, George took Helena to look at something in the garden, a transparent excuse to give Nathaniel and Eleanor a few minutes alone, done with such cheerful obviousness that Eleanor found herself grateful to George Carter in a way she had not previously expected. She and Nathaniel stood in the hallway near the bookshelf, and Nathaniel ran a hand along the spine of a volume and said, That went better than I expected. Elena is more honest than Whitmore, Eleanor said. She was protecting what she loves. That's different from protecting what she controls. Nathaniel looked at her. You liked her, he said, and he sounded surprised. Didn't dislike her, Eleanor said. That's progress. He was quiet for a moment. They were standing close enough that she was very aware of the small distance between them, not uncomfortable, not charged in any dramatic sense, simply present, the way a thing is present when you have spent weeks learning its dimensions. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer honestly. I generally do, she said, I know. He looked at the bookshelf. At her. Are you, what is this? He gestured between them, the same small, precise gesture as before. Is this? Eleanor held his gaze. She thought about the kitchen drawer. Note on one side and the letter on the other. She thought about Patience's hand in sand, and 7 children on the ridge, and the way he held himself still in crowds, and the almost smile, and the cramped handwriting getting less cramped. I don't know exactly what to call it yet, she said. I know it's real, and I know I'm not going anywhere. She paused. Is that enough for now? He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, something moved in his face, the deepest version of the expression she had been cataloging for 6 weeks, the one she had been not naming. Yes, he said quietly. That's enough. George came back through the hallway at that moment with the timing of a man who had counted to a respectable number and decided it was time to return. He looked between them with an expression of studied casualness. More coffee, he said. No, Nathaniel said. Yes, Eleanor said at the same time. George Carter's face broke into a genuine, unguarded smile, the first one she had seen from him, that wasn't performing anything at all. It went to get the coffee. The second document from Whitmore arrived 9 days later. Not a petition this time. A formal complaint filed with the county clerk's office under the property ordinance citing that Carter Estate had been used for commercial purposes without proper county registration, specifically the operation of mechanical design workshop that produced goods and installations for compensation. It was more targeted than the petition. Cleaner. Nathaniel had refused payment for every installation, which should have addressed the commercial element, but the complaint cited the sand trays. The 6 sand trays he had built for Eleanor's teaching sessions. The complaint argued that because Eleanor received compensation, however modest, for her teaching work, and because the teaching work used equipment produced at Carter Estate, this constituted indirect commercial production. It was, in architectural terms, brilliant, and Eleanor knew immediately that Charles Whitmore had not written it himself. Someone with legal training had written it, and Whitmore had paid for that training. Nathaniel read the complaint at her kitchen table, brought it there because he had gone to the clerk's office when he heard and come directly to her rather than to George, which she noted. He read it with the same complete stillness he had brought to Helena's letter. When he looked up, his expression was controlled in a way she had not seen before, controlled with more effort than usual. He's not trying to stop the water wheels, Nathaniel said. He doesn't care about the water wheels. No, Eleanor said. He's trying to force me to prove I have the right to exist on my own property. The words came out flat, and even, and beneath them something was not flat and not even at all. If the county rules against the complaint, it costs me time and legal fees and reputation regardless of the outcome. If the county rules for it, he controls what I can do at the estate. Yes, Eleanor said, and the sand trays. He looked at her. He used the sand trays because he knew, he calculated, that using them would affect you. Would make you feel responsible. Eleanor was quiet. He said, feel responsible? She looked at him steadily. For 6 sand trays that are helping 7 children learn to read, she said. No, I don't feel responsible for that. He held her gaze. Ned. What I feel, she said, is angry. Which is different and considerably more useful. Something in his jaw unclenched by a fraction. What do we do? She had been thinking about this since the complaint arrived, since Margaret Hollis had appeared at her door for the 2nd time in a month with news carrier's posture. She had been thinking about it in the measured, structural way she thought about problems that had a solution if you found the right angle. The complaint cites indirect commercial production, she said. The argument is that the sand trays are teaching equipment used in a compensated activity. And the counter-argument is that they were donated, freely given, without expectation of return or benefit. And the evidence for that is in the nature of every other thing Nathaniel has built and given away. She paused. Daniel Marsh, she said. Nathaniel looked at her. He assessed the water wheel design for the committee, Eleanor said. He knows the quality of the work. He knows the Harrison installation. If he's willing to write a second letter not about engineering this time, but about the pattern of the work. Harrison's, the Piketts, the sand trays. The fact that not one of these things was compensation-driven. A character argument, Nathaniel said. A documented pattern of charitable intent, she said. Which is different from a character argument because it has evidence attached. Quiet. There's something else, he said. Tell me. He looked at the complaint on her kitchen table. The legal fee issue, he said. Even if we counter this, even if Marsh writes the letter and the county rules in our favor, Whitmore can file again. He can find another angle. He has money and he has a lawyer, and he has the patience of a man who has decided this is worth pursuing. He looked up. I can counter each individual thing, but I can't counter the strategy indefinitely. Not without a different kind of answer. Eleanor felt the specific weight of what he was saying. She had been thinking about it too, just had not said it yet. You need a lawyer, she said. I need a lawyer who knows county property law and isn't already in Whitmore's social circle, he said. In Harlan County is limited, Eleanor said. Extremely limited, he said. She was quiet. She turned something over in her mind that she had been turning over for 2 days. since the complaint arrived, since she had sat in her garden and thought about angles and approaches. Lexington, she said. He looked at her. There's a lawyer in Lexington, she said. A man named Carver. Thomas Carver. He handled a property dispute for the widow Haynes before she moved. Complicated boundary matter. 3 families involved. Harlan County jurisdiction. He won it cleanly and he charged her what she could pay. She paused. He's not in Whitmore's social circle because he's not in Harlan County's social circle. He's 50 miles away and he has his own practice. Nathaniel was very still. How do you know about him? The widow Haynes told me, Eleanor said, when she was preparing to move to her daughters. She said if I ever needed someone who knew county property law and had a spine, she'd recommend Carver. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. You've been holding that in reserve, he said. I was waiting to see if we'd need it, she said. We need it. Quiet for a moment. Lexington is 2 days' ride. I know, she said. I'd have to go for at least 3 days. Possibly 4. I know, she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between reluctance and resolution. While I'm gone, he said, Whitmore will know I'm gone. He'll know it quickly, she agreed. Harlan County watches the roads. He may if he thinks the estate is unattended. George is here, Eleanor said. I'm here. He looked at her very directly. Eleanor. I don't want you to... I'm not asking your permission, she said. Not harshly, but clearly. George will manage the estate. I will continue the teaching sessions with the children. And if Whitmore tries anything while you're gone, there will be witnesses, and there will be a record of it, and Thomas Carver will have additional documentation when you arrive in Lexington. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, You're the most practical person I have ever met. That's not a romantic thing to say, she said. It's the truest thing I know how to say right now, he said. She felt the warmth of it, the specific, precise warmth of being known accurately by someone who pays real attention. Go to Lexington, she said. Come back with Carver's agreement. We'll handle everything else. He left on Wednesday. He told her on Tuesday evening, standing on her porch in the dark the way he had stood there before. And I said Thomas Carver had agreed to its initial consultation, and he would ride at first light, and he expected to return by Saturday at the latest. All right, she said. He stood there for a moment. Cicadas were quieter now, late August, sound of them beginning to thin. I'll start it. I'm another stop. She waited. I'm not good at this, he said. He made a gesture that encompassed, she understood, everything from the last 6 weeks. I know that. I don't always know what to, Nathaniel, she said. Stopped. Come back, she said simply. He looked at her. After a moment, yes, he said. He left. He did not sleep well. She did not acknowledge this to herself until Thursday morning, when she was short-tempered with the postal rider for arriving late. And she recognized the sleeplessness and the short temper as the particular profile of someone who is worried about a specific person and trying not to be, and she decided to stop trying not to be and simply be worried and move through it. The teaching sessions helped. Tuesday and Thursday the children came to the East Wing room, which Eleanor Carter had cleared efficiently and completely, even adding a small table Eleanor hadn't asked for and a second lamp. Patience wrote full sentences now. A 7-year-old named Edmund, who had come resist and been won over by the sand tray within 2 sessions, was reading from the small collection of pamphlets Eleanor had assembled. The room had the specific quality that good teaching spaces have, a concentrated, purposeful aliveness. Eleanor came to the doorway on Thursday morning. She stood there and watched for a moment, and Eleanor, seeing her from the corner of her eye, did not stop the lesson but acknowledged Helena with a small nod. Helena nodded back. Left, she without saying anything. Came back 15 minutes later with a plate of biscuits and set them on the table near the door. And Eleanor said, Thank you, Mrs. Carter, and the children said, with the varying degrees of training and courtesy that they possessed, Thank you, ma'am. And Helena's expression did something that was not quite a smile, but had the ingredients of one. Whitmore moved on Friday. Eleanor heard it from Margaret Hollis, who heard it from her husband Thomas, who had been at the mill when Whitmore arrived there to speak with George. George had not been told Eleanor was teaching at the estate, or rather, been told but had not understood. According to Thomas Hollis, this meant Eleanor was on the property daily. When Whitmore mentioned, casually, that he understood, Carter Estate was now hosting a school operated by Eleanor Whitfield, George had apparently gone very quiet. Aunt says George didn't say much to Whitmore, Margaret told her. After Whitmore left, George sent someone to the estate. Eleanor was at the estate when George's man arrived, a young farmhand named Crispin, who had the look of someone carrying a message he didn't fully understand. Said George Carter was requesting that Eleanor come to the mill to speak with him. Eleanor looked at Crispin. "Tell Mr. Carter I'll be at the estate when he gets here," she said. "Knows where the East Wing is." Crispin blinked. "Ma'am," he said. "I heard you," Eleanor said. "Tell him I'll be here." She went back to the children. George Carter arrived at the estate 40 minutes later. She heard him in the hallway and excused herself from the lesson and came out to find him standing in the passage with the expression of a man who is carrying something complicated and isn't sure whether he's going to put it down gently or drop it. "Eleanor," he said. "George," she said. "Come in." She went to the small room off the workshop passage, not the teaching room, the adjacent one, empty except for a chair and a workbench. She stood near the workbench and waited. George came in. He looked at the room. He looked at her. "Whitmore came to the mill," he said. "I know," she said. "Margaret told me." George stopped. "He said things that I'm not going to repeat to you because most of them were about your character, and none of them were true, and I told him so." Eleanor held very still. "You told him so," she said. "I told him," Age said, with the particular emphasis of a man who wants something on record, that Eleanor Whitfield was a woman of integrity who had done more for the Carter estate and the Ridge families in 6 weeks than most people in Harlan County had done in years, and that if he had concerns about the property he could address them through proper legal channels, and that his continued commentary on the personal lives of my family members was no longer welcome at the Carter mill. The stillness in Eleanor's chest shifted into something warm and complicated. "George," she said. I also told him," Age said, "that Nathaniel has gone to Lexington to consult a lawyer. When Nathaniel returns, we will be pursuing a full legal response to the property complaint. That the County Inspection Committee, the one with Daniel Marsh on it, has already issued a preliminary finding in favor of the Carter designs." Eleanor looked at him. "The committee issued a finding." "This morning," George said. "Marsh sent the letter to Aldridge's office yesterday. I got a copy this morning. Whitmore doesn't have one yet." He reached into his coat and produced folded document. He held it out to her. "I thought you should see it." She took it. She unfolded it. She read. The finding was formal and precise in the language of county administrative documents, but its content was unmistakable. Daniel Marsh, in his capacity as senior technical advisor to the committee, had found that the Carter water wheel design met all applicable safety standards. The installations at the Harrison and Pikett properties were structurally sound and posed no risk to county residents, and that the pattern of installation provided at no charge, with full instruction, to families in need demonstrated a clear charitable intent incompatible with the commercial designation cited in Whitmore's complaint. At the bottom, in a section labeled Additional Observations, Marsh had written, "In 40 years of county engineering assessment, I have not encountered work of this quality produced with such complete disregard for personal financial gain. A county should consider itself fortunate to have such a man working within it." Eleanor read that last sentence twice. Then she folded the document carefully and held it in both hands. "Thank you," she said to George. Her voice was entirely steady, and she was very glad of it. George looked at her. He doesn't know yet, he said. Nathaniel. He's in Lexington. He'll be back Saturday, she said. I know. George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I owe you an apology. A real one. Not implied. Eleanor looked at him. I thought you were... I told myself I was protecting him. He stopped. I was managing him. The way you said. I was wrong about you, specifically, in ways that I should have corrected sooner. He met her eyes. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I accept that, she said. Nodded. He looked down at the workbench. He's different, George said. It's you. He searched for the word. Present, he said finally. He's more present than he's been since before the war. To supper, he talks. George stopped. I haven't heard him laugh in 3 years. He laughed last week. Helena told me. She heard it from the sitting room while he was talking to you in the hallway. Eleanor thought about what she'd said that had made him laugh. She couldn't remember exactly. Something about Whitmore's petition, something she'd said was more useful as kindling. Something small that had been real. He's a good man, she said. He's always been a good man. Someone to be in the room with him, George said quietly. At the room being a performance. Yes, she said. George picked up his hat from the workbench where he'd set it. Whitmore's going to fight the committee finding, he said. He'll appeal to Aldridge. He'll claim Marsh is biased in favor of the Carters. He'll file something with the circuit court if the county doesn't give him what he wants. No, Eleanor said. Carver, George said. In Lexington. Is he good? The widow Haynes said he was the best property lawyer in 3 counties, Eleanor said. George nodded. Good. He moved toward the door. He stopped. Children, he said. In the East Wing. Helena said he cleared his throat. Helena said she thought the small table was too low for the older ones. She's going to see about having a proper one built. Eleanor looked at him. She's going to have a table built, she said. She mentioned it, George said, with the entirely unconvincing casualness of a man reporting his wife's decisions as though they are minor logistical details. Tell her I said thank you, Eleanor said. George Carter put his hat on and went back down the hallway, and Eleanor listened to his footsteps and then stood alone in the small room and held the folded document in both hands and thought about Daniel Marsh writing the county should consider itself fortunate, and about a laugh heard from a sitting room, and about a table being built for children who had started the summer writing in sand. Nathaniel came back on Saturday. Not the evening, as she had expected, the morning, 2 hours after first light, having ridden through the night, because, he told her later, he had decided Thursday that he had what he needed from Carver, and there was no reason to wait. He came to her house first, not the estate. She opened the door, and he was standing on her porch, with dust from the road on his coat and his hat, and the expression of a man who has been solving problems at speed for 3 days, and has arrived somewhere he had been thinking about since he left. Carver agreed, he said. He's filing a formal response to the property complaint by Wednesday. He says the sand tray argument is the weakest thing Whitmore has put forward yet, and he can dismantle it in 2 paragraphs. He also says if Whitmore pursues this to the circuit court, he's building a pattern of harassment that will ultimately cost Whitmore more than it costs us. Eleanor said, Come in. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table and she put coffee in front of him, and he drank it, and she sat across from him and said, The committee issued its finding Thursday. Marsh wrote something in the additional observations section that you should read. She put the document which George had left with her on the table. He read it. He read Marsh's additional observation twice. Something moved in his face that she had not seen before, not the almost smile, not the careful containment, something less guarded than both, something that had the quality of a thing long held finally putting itself down. He set the document on the table. He was quiet for a moment. Organize all of this, he said, while I was gone. George helped, she said, and Marsh did most of the work. Eleanor, he said her name in a way that stopped her. He looked at her across the kitchen table, the same table where they had spread drawings. In July, she had served suppers to him and George and built something she still didn't have a complete word for. I have been for 3 years. I have been managing my own life very carefully. I have been keeping it small enough that I could maintain it alone. Enough that the parts of me that don't. He stopped. Again. I gave up on the idea that someone else could be in it. In the actual structure of it. Not as a visitor. She held very still. You're not a visitor, he said. I haven't known how to say that. I've been trying to say it since the churchyard, Nathaniel, she said. I know it's not, I know I'm not. He looked down at his hands and then back at her. I know the county has made things difficult for you. I know, Helena. Nathaniel, she said again. He stopped. She leaned forward slightly across the table. I know, she said. I know what you're saying. I've known for a while what you're saying. She held his gaze. I'm saying it back. He looked at her. I'm not a visitor either, she said. The stillness that came over him was the deep kind, not the wall kind, not the war kind, not the crowd management kind she had catalogued over 6 weeks. This stillness was the kind that comes after something that has been held for a long time is finally allowed to be put down. The kind that is the sound of a person arriving somewhere. Reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. His hand was warm and calloused and careful. And she thought about a child's horse repaired in the middle of a room full of laughter, and a man who built 6 sand trays before she woke up, and a note that said, "Your students are fortunate," and all the distance between July, and now that had been covered, mile by careful mile, without either of them running. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen, in the August morning light, with the document on the table between them and the sound of the summer outside, and everything that was still to be handled, Whitmore and Carver, and the circuit court, and Helena's table, and the East Ridge families and 10 children who needed a winter school, all of it still there, still real, still requiring attention. But here, in this room, at this table, the most important thing had been said. And it did not need to be said again. That afternoon, Eleanor went back to the estate for the Friday session she had added. 3 new children from the East Ridge sat in the room alongside the original 7, including Mary Allen's youngest, who was 4 and had come because his mother had no one to leave him with, and Eleanor had said, without hesitation, "Heather, bring him." The 4-year-old sat beside Patience and watched her write in the sand with enormous concentrated eyes. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway midway through the session. He stood there the way he had stood at edges of rooms for 3 years, except that this time it was different. This time he was not at the edge, because he didn't belong inside. He was at the edge because he was watching something he had helped build, and the watching had its own quality of belonging. Patience looked up and saw him. "Mr. Carter," she said, with the directness of a 6-year-old, who has not yet learned to be coy. "Come see what I wrote." He came in. He crouched beside her and looked at the sand tray. Written, "The sun is warm and the creek runs fast and I am learning." Looked at it for a moment. "That's a complete sentence," he said. 3 of them. Miss Eleanor says 3 sentences is a paragraph, Patience said, with the satisfaction of someone reporting a recent advancement in their understanding of the world. "Miss Eleanor is right," he said. He straightened. He looked at Eleanor across the room. She was watching him with the expression she usually kept more carefully guarded, the one she had learned to be honest about only recently. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked around the room at the 10 children with their sand trays and their sticks, at Helena's table against the wall, at the 2 windows, throwing good light across the floor, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on him before, and would always, afterward, be able to place exactly. It was the expression of a man who has come home. To a building, not to an estate, to a life he had stopped believing he was allowed to have. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the doorframe. Looked at Eleanor once more. "I'll be in the workshop," he said. "If anyone needs me, someone will," she said. He left. Said, "Is Mr. Carter your friend, Miss Eleanor?" Eleanor looked at the doorway he had walked through. Nay, she thought about all the words that were true, and all the words that were not quite large enough. "Yes," she said, "he is." Patience considered this with the philosophical gravity of a 6-year-old. "He's quiet," she said. "He is," Eleanor said. "But he fixed my horse," Patience said. "And he made the tray." She smoothed the sand with her small palm, a clean surface, ready for the next word. "Think quiet people do more than they say." Eleanor looked at her. Then she said, "Write that down, Patience." And Patience picked up her stick, and the room was full of the small sounds of children learning. And outside the window the August day went on, and somewhere in the East Wing workshop, a man who had spent 3 years keeping his life small enough to survive was, for the first time, letting it as it actually was. Thomas Carver arrived in Harlan County on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Nathaniel had ridden to Lexington and back in the dark. He was not what Eleanor had expected. She had imagined someone large and formal, a man who filled a room with legal authority the way Whitmore filled rooms with money. Carver was slight, 62, a dry, economical manner that suggested he had spent 4 decades watching people underestimate him and had long since stopped finding it interesting. He arrived at Carter Estate in a hired wagon, unloaded a single bag. A shook Nathaniel's hand. A shook Eleanor's hand with the same weight, and said, "Nah, show me everything." They showed him everything. He sat at the kitchen table, Eleanor's kitchen table, where the drawings had been spread, where George had eaten supper, where Nathaniel had held her hand on a Saturday morning, and he read every document. Petition, the property complaint, the committee finding, Marcia's letter, Helena's note, which Eleanor produced without comment. He read all of it without speaking. When he finished, he set the papers in a precise stack and looked at Nathaniel. "Whitmore's not stupid," he said. "Whoever wrote the property complaint has legal training. This is not a man acting out of wounded pride. This is a man who decided to win something and retained professional assistance to do it." "No," Nathaniel said. "Which means," Carver said, "that responding through normal county channels will not be sufficient. He'll keep filing. Variation after variation, each one requiring a response, each one costing you time and money regardless of outcome." He paused. "You need to end the pattern, not just the current complaint," Eleanor said. Carver looked at her. "You end the pattern by making the pattern itself the subject of legal scrutiny," he said. "If I can demonstrate to the circuit court that the sequence of filings, the petition, the complaint, the anticipated appeal of the committee finding, constitutes a coordinated campaign of legal harassment against a private citizen, the court can issue a finding that future filings of this nature require pre-approval from the circuit judge." He paused. "It doesn't silence Whitmore, but it makes every future move cost him something in credibility as well as money." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Can you demonstrate that?" "I need 3 things," Carver said. "Documented evidence of the pattern which you have. Testimony from county residents about the nature of the campaign which, based on what you've described, should be findable. And something that establishes Whitmore's personal motivation beyond legitimate legal concern." He looked at Nathaniel directly. "Is there anything in your history with Whitmore that predates all of this? Any specific incident that would explain why he chose you?" Nathaniel was quiet. Eleanor looked at him. She had not heard this part, had not asked, because she had understood instinctively that there were edges of Nathaniel's history that he would share in his own time and on his own terms. Looked at the table, then at Carver. 3 years ago," he said, "when I came back from the war, I came home to find that Whitmore had approached my brother about purchasing the eastern portion of the Carter property. Ridge section, 200 acres. A pause. George had not agreed, but he had not refused either. He told me about it when I arrived and asked my opinion." He paused again. "I told George that selling any portion of the Carter land to Whitmore was something I would not agree to. Under any circumstances." Carver held very still. "George refused on your behalf." George refused, Nathaniel said. And Whitmore, I was at the meeting. I came with George. Whitmore made an argument. I made a counter-argument. It was not he stopped. It was a direct exchange. Whitmore does not have direct exchanges. He was not prepared for one. He was embarrassed, Eleanor said quietly. In front of George and two of Whitmore's own associates, Nathaniel said. Yes. Carver picked up his pen. That's the motivation, he said. That's what I needed. He wrote something on a fresh sheet. This was never about the water wheels. This was never about Eleanor Whitfield. Man, this was about a man who was outmaneuvered 3 years ago by someone he considered beneath his consideration, who has been waiting for a position of weakness in which to retaliate. The room was very quiet. Nathaniel said he waited 3 years. He waited until you had something worth protecting, Nan, Carver said, and he looked briefly at Eleanor, without elaborating, and Eleanor felt the precise, specific weight of that sentence land in her chest. He waited until Nathaniel had something worth protecting. Until there was someone to use as a point of pressure. She thought about Helena's letter on her kitchen table. She thought about someone walking into her house. She thought about the property complaint citing the sand trays, specifically sand trays, built by a man for a woman who taught 7 children, weaponized into a legal document. Whitmore had not come after Nathaniel directly. He had come after the thing Nathaniel cared about. That was the strategy, and she had been the instrument of it. She said nothing about this until Carver had retired to the guest room that George had prepared, and Nathaniel walked her to her horse in the early evening. She had been quiet for the last hour of the meeting, quiet enough that Nathaniel had noticed, because he noticed everything about her. Say it, he said. She looked at him. He used me, she said. Whitmore, the letters, the complaint that he didn't come after you through the county, because that was too direct. He came after you through me because he calculated that was the point of most pressure. Yes, Nathaniel said. And I walked right into the middle of it, she said. I walked into that gathering. I defended you. I made myself. Eleanor, his voice was quiet and entirely firm. Stop. What you did, he said, is what you did. Not what Whitmore made of it. What you did was sit next to a man at a gathering and have a conversation. What you did was answer letters about water wheels and teach children in sand. What you did was go to Commissioner Aldridge with Elisha Harrison and Daniel Marsh and build a case that a man with legal training and 20 years in the county could not simply dismiss. He held her gaze. Whitmore didn't create any of that. He tried to use it. Those are different things. She looked at him. I put you at risk, she said. By being here. By being visible. You put me in the county meeting, he said. You put me in Commissioner Aldridge's office. You put me in my brother's house for supper. Something moved in his face, not quite the almost smile. Something more serious than that. You put me in my own life, Eleanor. That's not risk. That's the opposite of risk. She held very still. Don't apologize for being here, he said. Don't apologize for any of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You're better at this than you think you are. At what? At saying the right thing, she said. He held her gaze. I have motivation, he said simply. She took her horse's reins. She mounted. She looked down at him from the saddle in the evening light. Carver's plan, she said. The harassment finding. It'll work? He seems confident, Nathaniel said. He seems like a man who doesn't express confidence he doesn't have, she said. Yes, Nathaniel said. That's why I rode 2 days to find him. She turned her horse toward the road. I'll be here Thursday, she said. Children. I know, he said. She rode home through the late August evening, and she thought about what he had said, you put me in my own life, and she thought about a man who had spent 3 years keeping everything small, and a woman who had spent 2 years keeping everything careful, and the way 2 carefully small lives had expanded, without either of them planning it, into something that was neither small nor careful at all. Yet, I am not sorry. She was not sorry. The circuit court hearing was scheduled for the second week of September. Carver filed his response to the property complaint on Wednesday, and the circuit judge, a man named Beaumont, who had the reputation of someone who had seen every variety of county dispute and had lost patience with the manufactured ones, agreed to hear the harassment argument alongside the complaint itself. This was the first sign, Carver told them, that the judge had read the filing and understood what it was about. Whitmore's lawyer, a man from Lexington whom no one in Harlan County had previously encountered, filed a counter-response within 2 days, arguing that characterizing lawful legal filings as harassment was itself a form of intimidation designed to suppress legitimate civic participation. It was well written. Carver read it, said adequate, and went back to his preparation. The week before the hearing, 3 things happened. The first, Elias Harrison appeared at Carter Estate unannounced and told Nathaniel that he wanted to testify at the hearing if testifying was something a man could do. Hansned he would ask Carver. Carver said yes, absolutely, and please also ask Mary Allen's husband and any other Ridge family currently using or waiting on an installation. Families signed on to testify. The second, George Carter went to see Commissioner Aldridge alone, without telling Nathaniel first, and came back with the information that Aldridge had decided to submit a written statement to the circuit court supporting the committee's finding, and noting that in his professional assessment, the sequence of Whitmore's filings suggested a pattern inconsistent with genuine public safety concerns. George delivered this information at supper on Sunday with the expression of a man who has done something he is proud of and is being moderately restrained about it. Nathaniel looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," George said. "I should have done it sooner." Eleanor looked at Helena across the table. Helena was looking at her hands. Then she looked up and met Eleanor's gaze, and something passed between them that was not yet friendship but was in the same territory, the shared acknowledgement of 2 women who had both underestimated each other and were engaged in the ongoing process of correcting that. The third, Charles Whitmore, came to Eleanor's house. He came on Friday morning alone, without advance notice, and knocked on her door with the knock of a man who believes the door will be opened for him. He opened it. She stood in the doorway and did not invite him in. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. He looked older than he had at the summer gathering. Not diminished, not yet, but carrying something that was beginning to show. "I think we should talk." "We can talk here," she said. He looked at the open doorway. "I'd prefer," she said. Her voice was entirely level. He adjusted. He had the manner of a man recalibrating to a situation that had not gone the way he'd expected and was too practiced to show the full extent of that. "I want you to understand," he said, "that none of what has happened was intended as a personal attack on you." Eleanor said nothing. "The concerns I raised about the property and the inspections," Whitmore said, "were legitimate questions of county governance. The fact that they involved Carter is incidental to mine." "Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor said, "what is it you actually want from this conversation?" He looked at her. Something moved in his face, a flash of the genuine anger she had seen in the courthouse, quickly controlled. "Hearing," he said. "The harassment argument Carver has filed. If it succeeds, it creates a precedent in this county that any resident who raises concerns about a neighbor's activities can be legally labeled a harasser. That's not a finding that benefits anyone. It benefits anyone who isn't engaged in harassment," Eleanor said. His jaw tightened. "I came here to suggest that there may be a way to resolve this before it reaches a courtroom," he said. If Carter were to agree to submit future mechanical installations to a county review, a genuinely independent review, not the Marsh Committee, and if certain other aspects of the current arrangement, he glanced toward the interior of her house and back, were regularized, I think we could find a mutual understanding. Eleanor understood in very precise terms what he was proposing. He was proposing that Nathaniel submit to his version of oversight and that Eleanor the current arrangement be resolved, which was a careful word for a clear meaning. She looked at Charles Whitmore for a long moment. She thought about a boy's wooden horse repaired in the middle of a laughing room. Thought about 6 sand trays on a porch before dawn. She thought about patients writing "I am learning." She thought about a man saying, "You put me in my own life," and meaning it the way people mean things that are simply and completely true. "No," she said. Whitmore looked at her. "Mrs. Whitfield." "No," she said again. "We'll see you in court, Mr. Whitmore." She closed the door. She stood in her hallway for a moment. Her hands were entirely steady. She found that notable and was glad of it. Then she went to her kitchen and wrote a note to Nathaniel that said, "Whitmore came this morning. He suggested a settlement involving your submission to his oversight committee and the resolution of our arrangement. I declined both. I thought you should know before Friday." She sent it. His response came within the hour, faster than the postal rider should have been able to manage it, which meant he had been near the road when Crispin brought it. It said, "Thank you for telling me. Are you all right?" Back, "I'm better than all right. How are you?" His response, "Ready." The hearing was on a Thursday. Courthouse in Harlan County, held at capacity, perhaps 80 people. By 7 in the morning, with the hearing not starting until 9, there were already people standing in the yard outside. Harlan County did not pass up a Carter event, and this one had been building for weeks in the specific pressurized way that county events build when everyone has an opinion, and no one has been able to express it in a definitive public forum. Eleanor arrived with Margaret Hollis. Nathaniel arrived with George and Carver, and, behind them, Elias Harrison and 3 other Ridge family representatives who had driven their wagons from the north at first light. Whitmore arrived with his Lexington lawyer and 2 of his business associates, and the particular composure of a man who has convinced himself, through some combination of money and habit, that he is still in control of a situation. He was not in control of the situation. Judge Beaumont was 70 years old, had been on the circuit court for 22 years, and had the attention of a man who has spent 2 decades listening to people carefully lie to him and has become extremely good at hearing the difference. He let both sides their arguments in full. He asked questions. He asked Carver a specific question about the 3-year gap between the land refusal and the first petition. And he asked Whitmore's lawyer a specific question about the legal training evident in the property complaint, who had provided that training. And Whitmore's lawyer hesitated for 1 second, too long before answering. Beaumont noticed. Eleanor could see him notice. Elias Harrison testified. He was not a polished speaker. He was a 52-year-old farmer who stood in the witness position and spoke about his creek and his 7 children and his 12-mile cart to the mill and the wheel that had been running since August, and he said, "I have been in this county for 30 years. And I have never had a neighbor give me something real without asking for anything back, not once. Carter did, and I'll be damned, pardon me. Your Honor, I'll be plain about that." A sound moved through the room. Mary Allen's husband testified about the East Ridge and the school in the Carter East, and what it meant that 10 children were learning to read in a room that had been empty for years. He was quiet and specific, and he looked at neither Whitmore nor Nathaniel while he spoke. Only at the judge, which was the most effective thing he could have done. Daniel Marsh's letter was read into the record. The whole thing, including the additional observation. When the clerk read the county should consider itself fortunate to have such a man working within it, the room was very quiet. Then Whitmore's lawyer made his closing argument, which was coherent and professionally constructed and addressed the legal elements of the harassment standard with appropriate precision. And Carswell stood. Carver spoke for 11 minutes. Eleanor timed it. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform outrage or appeal to sentiment. He laid the chronology out like a surveyor, laying out a property line, clear, precise, connected point to point, and when he reached the land refusal from 3 years ago, he did not dramatize it. He simply placed it in the sequence where it belonged and let the sequence speak. He said, "Your Honor, I would ask the court to consider what motivated this sequence of actions. Not what was written in the filings, what motivated the writing of them." Man was publicly refused a land acquisition by someone he expected to defer to him. 3 years later, when that same man found something in his life worth protecting, the filings began. The first filing came 11 days after a public gathering at which Nathaniel Carter was seen in extended conversation with Eleanor Whitfield. The second filing came 4 days after Carter's successful presentation at the county meeting, a presentation that publicly demonstrated Carter's competence in a room where Whitmore had expected him to falter. He paused. This is not county governance. This is a man using the legal system as a personal instrument. And the court has both the authority, and I would argue, the obligation to say so. The room was entirely still. Judge Beaumont looked at his papers. He looked at Whitmore. He looked at Carver. He looked, briefly, at Nathaniel, a long, assessing look, the look of a man taking a full measurement. Then he said, "I'll recess for 30 minutes. The 30 minutes were the longest Eleanor had spent since the morning she'd read Helena's letter. She stood in the courthouse yard with Margaret on one side and Nathaniel on the other, and Nathaniel was very still in the way that was not the wall kind but the waiting kind. The kind she had learned to read as his particular version of controlled hope. George paced. Carver sat on a fence post and read a document he'd produced from his coat, apparently unconcerned, which Eleanor decided to take as a positive sign. "He's going to rule for us," Margaret said quietly. "You can't know that," Eleanor said. "I watched his face when Carver mentioned the land refusal," Margaret said. "He already knew. Someone told him before today. I don't know who." Eleanor glanced at George, who had stopped pacing, and was looking at a point in the middle distance with the expression of a man who has information he is waiting to be asked about. "George," Eleanor said. George looked at her. "Did you tell Beaumont about the land refusal?" she said. George adjusted his hat. "I may have mentioned certain historical context to the commissioner's office," he said. And the commissioner may have included certain background information in his written statement to the court." He paused. "I thought it was relevant." Nathaniel looked at his brother. "George." "It was relevant," George said firmly. And shifted in Nathaniel's expression, complicated, warm expression of a man recalibrating a relationship that had been strained in specific ways for 3 years and was, slowly and with effort on both sides, becoming something different. He said nothing, but he put his hand briefly on George's shoulder, and George looked at the ground and cleared his throat. Carver looked up from his document. The judge already knew, he confirmed. "Beaumont does his homework. That's why I filed for the harassment finding, rather than a standard defense." He would have read the history, regardless. He folded the document. George's information was useful corroboration. They went back inside. Judge Beaumont ruled in 22 minutes. He ruled in favor of the harassment finding. He ruled that the property complaint was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled in the same form. He ruled that future filings by Whitmore against Carter Estate or its associated operations would require pre-approval from the circuit court, with a demonstrated showing of new factual basis. He ruled that the county inspection committee, with Daniel Marsh serving, was the appropriate body for reviewing mechanical installations in the county, and that this committee's findings carried presumptive validity. And then he said something that was not in either party's filing. He said, "This court notes that the work undertaken by Nathaniel Carter, the water wheel installations, the charitable equipment provided to educational efforts in this county, represents exactly the kind of private initiative that strengthens a community." The residents of the Ridge families who testified today and the children learning in the East Wing of Carter Estate are the real plaintiffs in this case. They have not asked for anything except to be left alone to benefit from the work of a neighbor who asked nothing in return. This court declines to interfere with that work. He closed his papers. "We're done," he said. The room exhaled. Whitmore's lawyer was already gathering his documents with the precise, controlled movements of a man who knows when to cut losses and is doing so efficiently. Whitmore himself sat for a moment, after his lawyer stood just a moment, 3 or 4 seconds, and in those seconds, Eleanor watched something cross his face that she had not expected to see there. And not anger, but something older than anger. Something that looked, underneath everything, like the recognition of a man who has arrived at an outcome he cannot manage his way around. He stood, he put on his hat. He did not look at Nathaniel. He walked out of the courthouse with his lawyer and his associates, and he walked the way men walk when they have decided that visible dignity is the last available position. He did not look back. Outside, in the courthouse yard, Ridge families clustered around Nathaniel with the kind of warmth that is genuine and uncalculated. Elias Harrison shaking his hand and saying something low and direct. 80. Mary Allen's husband clapping him once on the shoulder, the others gathering in the way of people who have been in a difficult thing together and have come out the other side. Nathaniel stood in the middle of it with the expression she'd been watching evolve since July, past the almost smile, past the contained hope, into something she could now name without hesitation: present. Yeah, he was entirely present in that yard, with those people, in a way that 3 months ago would not have been possible. George shook Carver's hand. Helena, who had been in the back of the courthouse for the whole hearing, stood near the door with the expression of a woman who has watched something important happen and is in the process of incorporating it. Eleanor had not known she was there until the ruling. She found that she was glad. Margaret Hollis squeezed Eleanor's arm and said, "You did this." "Did this," Eleanor said. "Don't be modest," Margaret said. "Started it. You walked across a room in July." Eleanor looked across the yard at Nathaniel, who was shaking Daniel Marsh's hand. Marsh had appeared at some point during the recess. 71 years old, and beaming with the specific satisfaction of a man whose letter has been read aloud in a court of law. Nathaniel said something to Marsh, and Marsh laughed, and Nathaniel's face in the moment of that exchange was something Eleanor intended to keep. He looked up and found her across the yard. He looked at her the way he looked at things he considered most important, completely, without qualification. She tipped her head, just slightly, toward the road. He excused himself from Marsh and came to her. "All right," she said. "Yes," he said, and then better than all right. Yeah, she felt the return of her own words in his and did not try to suppress what moved through her face when she heard it. "East Wing room," he said. "The children. I've been thinking if you want to formalize it. A school, not just the room, but a properly designated school, with a deed of use, supported by the estate." Impermanent, he paused. Carver said he could draw up the documentation. Eleanor looked at him. "A real school," she said. "A real school," he said. "With the sand trays and Helena's table and whatever else you need." He held her gaze. "I want it to be real. Not just an arrangement. Something that stays." She thought about Patience writing "I Am Learning." She thought about 10 children in winter coming, and the East Ridge families, and all the things that could be built in a room with good windows and a fireplace that drew well. She said, "I want that." He nodded. He looked at the courthouse, at the yard, at the Ridge family still gathered, at George and Helena and Carver and Margaret. He looked at the county that had spent 3 years watching him from a careful distance. Then he looked back at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You could have asked at the courthouse," she said. The corner of his mouth moved the full version this time, the one that reached. "I know," he said. "I'm asking now." She waited. I have not done this before," he said. "Words are not. I don't always have the right words." You have the right words more often than you think," she said. Held her gaze. "Eleanor," he said, "will you stop?" He took a breath. "I want to do this correctly. I know what the county will say. I know that George will have opinions, and Helena will have opinions, and Whitmore, wherever he goes from here, will have opinions. I know all of that." He paused. "I don't care about any of it. I care that it's done correctly, which means I'm asking you properly, in the right place, at the right time. And I think this is the right place and the right time." Eleanor felt her heart doing something that was not ladylike, and she did not care even slightly. "Asking you," he said quietly, "to let me court you, properly and openly, without any more careful arrangements or implied understandings. I want people to know. I want it to be real." He looked at her with the entire unguarded weight of everything. He was the man who built sand trays in the dark, who counted children before walking through a gate, who fixed toys in the middle of a laughing room, who had spent 3 years keeping his life small and was standing here now asking to let it be large. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She thought about the kitchen drawer, the note on one side, the letter on the other, and she thought about how both sides of that drawer had led, by separate roads, to this courthouse yard on a September morning. And she thought about all the careful, measured, one step at a time miles they had traveled to arrive here. "Nathaniel," she said, "you have been courting me since August." They looked at her. "Everyone in this county knows it," she said. "Elias Harrison knows it. Daniel Marsh knows it. Margaret Hollis has known it since July, and has been exercising extraordinary restraint on the subject." She held his gaze. "The answer is yes. It has been yes for some time." And something happened in his face that she had never seen before, and would carry for the rest of her life, not the almost smile, and not the contained hope, and not the careful steadiness, but all of it at once, unlayered, full and unmanaged fact of a man who has been given back something he had stopped believing was possible. He reached out. He took her hand. He held it in the courthouse yard, in front of the Ridge families, and George Carter and Margaret Hollis, and anyone else who was watching, which was most of Harlan County, and he did not let go. 6 weeks later, the Carter Whitfield School opened in the east wing of Carter Estate. The deed of use was signed and recorded at the county clerk's office, the same office where Whitmore's petition had been filed, and it specified that the room was designated permanently for educational purposes, maintained by the estate, of charge to all county children, regardless of family income. It was signed by Nathaniel Carter and countersigned by Eleanor Whitfield as school director, and witnessed by George Carter and Daniel Marsh, who had insisted on being present, and who brought his wife, who brought a cake. 18 children came on the first day. Patience wrote her full name, and the names of both her parents and the name of the creek near her house in the sand tray, and then she looked at Eleanor and said, "Can I learn to write on paper now?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "You're ready." Patience accepted this with dignity and asked for a pen. The water wheel at the Harrison farm had been running for 2 months. The Piket installation had been completed in October and was working. 3 more families on the East Ridge had put in requests, which Nathaniel was working through in the methodical, patient way he worked through everything, one careful step at a time. On a Saturday in November, Anne County held its fall harvest, gathering the same kind of event as the Whitmore summer gathering, just as crowded, just as watched, just as aware of itself. Nathaniel came. He came with Eleanor, openly. The way he had said he wanted, not as a wealthy man and a widow of modest means navigating the complicated politics of a county that had opinions about them, but as 2 people who had decided, somewhere between a broken toy and a courthouse yard, that they belonged in each other's company. Walked into the gathering together. The room did not go silent the way it had in July. But something shifted. The quality of the attention changed. 8 people, turning, 18, registering. The collective processing of a county that had watched something develop and was now looking at the outcome. Eleanor felt it and held Nathaniel's gaze, and he held hers, and neither of them looked away from each other to manage anyone else's reaction. Elias Harrison crossed the room and shook Nathaniel's hand and said something to Eleanor that made her laugh, and that was the sound that broke the room open. Eleanor Whitfield, laughing at a harvest gathering, standing next to Nathaniel Carter, who was looking at her with an expression that required no interpretation. George found them near the refreshment table. He said, "Helena wants to know if you'll both come for Christmas." Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. "Yes," Eleanor said. George nodded. He started to move away. He stopped. He turned back. He looked at them both, his brother, New standing in the middle of a crowded room without any of the edge-hugging, wall-bracing, managed distance that had characterized 3 years of gatherings. Standing with his hat in his hand and his shoulders easy and his attention fully, simply on the woman beside him. And George Carter, who had loved his brother through 3 years of not knowing how to help him, looked at what 3 months of not managing had made possible, and he said nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed to be said. He put his hat back on and walked away. Atakin, later that evening, on Eleanor's porch, in the November cold that had replaced the August heat, stood beside her and looked at the road and said, what do you want? For all of it. Next, for whatever comes next. Eleanor thought about it honestly. The school to grow, she said. A proper building eventually, not just a room. Enough families on the ridge with reliable milling that they have time to think about what else their children need. A county that sees what's possible when it stops managing the people who don't fit its expectations. She paused. And you, she said simply. All of the above and you. He was quiet for a moment. That's a large answer. Asked a large question, she said. He looked at her. I'm going to build a bigger school, he said. I already have the drawings. Of course he did. Of course he had been drawing it probably since August. Probably since the first Tuesday the children came to the East Wing. Probably the way he did everything. Measuring and calculating and planning. Carefully and completely, before the first step was taken. She thought, this is the man, this specific, precise, deliberate man who builds 6 sand trays before sunrise and draws school buildings, before asking permission and repairs broken things quietly in the middle of laughing rooms. This man. Show me the drawings, she said. Tomorrow, he said. They're in the workshop. Then tomorrow, she said. He took her hand. They stood on the porch in the November dark, and the road was quiet, and somewhere down the county, the harvest gathering was still going on, and the Carter Whitfield School had 18 children. And the water wheel at the Harrison farm was turning in the dark creek, and Charles Whitmore was in his house on the North Ridge, and none of that mattered as much as this porch, this hand, this man who had stopped keeping his life small. Harlan County had called him broken. He was not broken. He had been waiting quietly, carefully, with the extraordinary patience of someone who builds things that last, for the person who would walk across the room. She had walked across the room, and everything that was worth building, they had built together.